The carriage wheels hit a rut in the road, and Marin Ashford grabbed the leather strap above the window with both hands. The jolt rattled her teeth together. Outside, the trees along the Caldwell Estate Road were tall and close and old, their branches reaching across the path like arms trying to stop her from moving forward. She had been in this carriage for 4 hours. She had not slept in 2 days, and she was about to arrive at the home of a man she had never met, to live under his roof, because her father had died and left nothing behind except debts that now had someone else's name on them. She breathed through her nose and let go of the strap when the road smoothed again. Her maid, Clara, sat across from her, a small woman of 50, with a permanent expression of worried kindness. Clara had been with Marin's family since before Marin was born. She was the only person who had come with her from the old house. Everything else had been sold or taken. "Are you all right?" Clara asked. "Yes," Marin said. This was not true, but it was the only answer she had. The carriage slowed. Through the window she could see the gates of Caldwell Manor, iron, tall, and open, as though her arrival had been expected for some time. The grounds beyond the gates were green and wide. There was a fountain near the entrance that was not running. The water in its basin was still and dark. She watched it as the carriage passed, and thought it looked like something that had been beautiful once, and simply never been switched back on. The house itself was larger than she had imagined. 3 stories of pale stone, with windows that caught the gray afternoon light and gave nothing back. There were trimmed hedges along the front, and a short flight of stone steps leading to the main doors. 2 servants were already waiting on those steps. They stood very straight. They did not smile. The carriage stopped. Clara moved first, collecting their bags from the seat beside her. Marin smoothed her coat, checked that her hair was still pinned correctly, and pushed the carriage door open herself before the footman could reach it. She did not want to be helped out of a carriage like something fragile being unpacked. She stepped down onto the gravel drive. The air smelled of damp earth and cut grass, and something faintly sweet she could not identify. She stood still for a moment and looked at the house. It looked back. One of the waiting servants came forward, a woman, middle-aged, with a ring of keys at her hip and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had run large households for a long time. "Miss Ashford," the woman said, "I am Mrs. Elton. I manage the household. His Grace is expecting you. He asks that you rest and refresh yourself before dinner. I will show you to your rooms." "Thank you," Marin said. "How long until dinner?" 2 hours, miss. 2 hours to become whoever she was going to have to be inside this house. She picked up the smallest of her bags herself, ignoring Mrs. Elton's slight frown at this, and followed the woman up the steps and through the front doors. The inside of Caldwell Manor was exactly what she had expected, and nothing she had been prepared for. The entrance hall was high-ceilinged, with dark wood paneling and paintings on every wall. Men on horses, women in gardens, a landscape of somewhere cold and Scottish. A staircase rose at the far end, splitting at the landing into 2 directions. There was a fireplace large enough to stand in, and it was lit, and the warmth of it hit her face as she entered and made her eyes sting slightly. She had not been warm in several days. Mrs. Elton led her upstairs, down a corridor carpeted in deep blue, past doors that were all closed. She spoke as she walked, explaining the running of the house in short, efficient sentences. Breakfast was at 8, luncheon at 1, dinner at 7. The library was on the ground floor to the right. The morning room was for the household's general use. She would be allocated a sitting room of her own on this floor, adjacent to her bedroom. "His Grace wishes for you to be comfortable," Mrs. Elton said, pausing outside a door near the end of the corridor. "Does he?" Marin said. It came out more bluntly than she intended. Mrs. Elton's expression did not change. "He does, miss." She opened the door. The room inside was larger than any bedroom Marin had slept in for the past year. There was a wide bed with green curtains, a writing desk near the window, a wardrobe, a small fireplace that was also lit. On the desk, someone had placed a vase of white flowers. Marin did not know what kind they were. She stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long moment. "The flowers were Mr. Ethan's idea," Mrs. Elton said, and something in her voice softened very slightly on the name. "He thought the room should feel welcoming." "Mr. Ethan," Marin repeated. "The Duke's brother." "Yes, miss." She had known there was a brother. She had known very little else. The name Ethan Caldwell had appeared twice in the brief and impersonal letter she had received 2 weeks ago, informing her that the Caldwell estate had assumed her father's obligations, and that she was, at their invitation, to take up residence at the manor, as a ward of the household, until certain arrangements were finalized. The letter had been signed by the family solicitor. She had read it 4 times, looking for the part where it explained what she was supposed to do there, and had not found one. She walked into the room and set her bag down. "Thank you, Mrs. Elton. Dinner at 7, miss. I will send someone to assist you at 6:30. The housekeeper left. Clara came in behind her, already moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that unpacking was the first thing you did when the world came apart, because it gave you somewhere to put your hands. Marin went to the window. The back of the house faced a garden, more formal than she had expected, with gravel paths between low hedges and a row of bare rose bushes along the far wall. A man was crouching near one of the rose bushes. He was in shirt sleeves despite the cold, which struck her as either brave or careless. He had dark hair, and he appeared to be pulling weeds, which was an odd activity for someone who presumably employed people to do exactly that. As she watched, he stood up, looked at whatever he had pulled from the ground, and threw it over the garden wall with what looked like real satisfaction. Then he turned, and he looked up at the window where she was standing. She did not step back. She had nothing to feel caught doing. She was simply looking out of a window that faced a garden. He raised one hand in a brief, easy wave. She did not wave back. She moved away from the window. "Clara," she said. "Lay out the gray dress for tonight, please." "Yes, miss." She sat down at the writing desk and looked at the white flowers without seeing them. She needed to think carefully about this. She needed to understand, with complete clarity, what her situation actually was. Her father, Lord William Ashford, a man of considerable charm and considerably worse financial judgment, had died 3 months ago. He had died leaving behind a townhouse with a mortgage larger than its value, a country estate already sold to pay earlier debts, and a tangle of private loans that had taken the solicitors 2 full months to unravel. At the end of that unraveling, it had emerged that the largest single creditor was the Caldwell estate, specifically, a loan made some years ago, in private, between her father and the late Duke of Caldwell, who had died before the debt was repaid. The new Duke, Lord Callum Caldwell, was apparently not the kind of man who pressed a dead man's daughter for money. He was, instead, the kind of man who wrote through his solicitor and offered her a roof. She was not sure if this made him generous or calculating. She was not sure those were different things. She had no other options. This had been made clear to her, in the gentle and relentless way that people with no power are always made clear on the subject. Her mother had died when she was 12. She had no siblings. Her father's brother, her uncle, had emigrated to Canada 6 years ago and had not written since. She had friends from before, women she had grown up alongside, who had married and settled, and whose lives had moved on in the normal direction. But friendship does not pay rent, and sympathy does not keep you fed. So she had come here. She was going to be calm and polite and entirely self-possessed, and she was going to figure out exactly what she owed these people and how to repay it, and then she was going to leave. That was the plan. She was still sitting at the writing desk, turning this plan over in her mind, when Clara announced that it was 6:30 and held out the gray dress. Marin stood up, squared her shoulders, and went to dinner. The dining room was on the ground floor, at the end of the main corridor, through a set of double doors that were slightly too heavy to open with one hand, without looking like you were struggling. She pushed them open with both hands and walked in. The room was lit by candles, a great many of them, in a chandelier above the long table, and in holders along the sideboard. The table was set for 3. One man was already seated. He stood when she came in, and she had a moment to take him in, before the motion of his standing required her to address him. Lord Callum Caldwell was tall. He was lean in the way of a man who works rather than one who merely exercises, though she could not have said how she knew this. He had dark hair, cut short, and a face that was— she was looking for the right word, and found one she had not expected. Quiet. Not cold, not unfriendly, just very still, the way certain rooms are still, in a way that made you lower your own voice without knowing why. He said, "Miss Ashford, welcome to Caldwell Manor. I am glad you arrived safely." His voice was even, low. the kind of voice that did not raise itself for effect. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. The journey was very smooth. This was also not entirely true, but it was the correct thing to say. He gestured to the chair at his right. She sat. A moment later, the door at the other end of the room opened, and another man came in, still adjusting his jacket with the air of someone who had been called to the table slightly later than he had intended. He was younger than the Duke, lighter in build, lighter in manner, lighter in everything. His eyes were quick and bright, and he came into the room the way some people enter rooms, as though they are mildly pleased to find themselves there. He caught her eye immediately, and something in his face shifted from its default brightness into something warmer and more deliberate. "You must be Miss Ashford," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I am Ethan. I would say I am delighted to meet you, but Mrs. Elton has a rule about declarations at the dinner table, so I will simply say, welcome." Marin looked at him. "I don't believe Mrs. Elton has that rule." Ethan's mouth curved. "No," he said, "she doesn't. But she should." Across the table, Callum Caldwell picked up his wineglass and said nothing. She could not tell, from his expression, whether he found his brother amusing or merely familiar. It was the face of a man who had long since stopped reacting to things he had seen many times before. The soup arrived. She was hungry, more than she had realized, having eaten very little during the journey, and she was careful to eat slowly and steadily, the way her mother had taught her, because eating quickly when you were hungry was a sign of desperation, and desperation was the one thing you could never afford to let anyone see. "How was the journey?" Callum asked. "Very pleasant," she said. "The roads were good." "It rained in the valley this morning," Ethan said. "Was it wet when you came through?" "Briefly," she said. "You came from London, I understand." "From the townhouse, yes." "Is it—" He paused, and she watched him reroute whatever he had been about to say. "Is London in good form at the moment? I have not been down in several months." "It is London," she said. "It is always in approximately the same form." Ethan laughed. The Duke's mouth moved slightly in what might, in another man, have been the beginning of a smile. She ate her soup. The conversation moved in careful, polite circles, the kind of conversation that is really a series of tests disguised as pleasantries. She gave short, complete answers. She did not ask questions that would seem invasive. She did not volunteer information that would invite sympathy. She was perfectly pleasant and perfectly unrevealing, and she was very good at it, because she had had a great deal of practice in the past few months at being in rooms where people knew about her situation, and she needed them to know nothing about what it felt like. After the third course, Callum set down his fork and looked at her. "I want to be direct with you, Miss Ashford," he said, "so that you are not left wondering about your situation here." She met his eyes. They were gray, she noticed, very steady. "I would appreciate that, Your Grace. You are here as our guest," he said. "Not as a dependent or an obligation. I want to be clear on that distinction. My father made a private arrangement with your father many years ago. The details of that arrangement are between families, and they are not a debt to be collected. You are welcome here for as long as you need to be here, without condition." She looked at him for a moment. "That is very generous." "It is simply what is right," he said, with no particular warmth and no particular coldness, as though the rightness of it was a fact, like the weight of a table or the direction of a river. She did not know what to do with this. She had prepared for obligation. She had prepared for condescension, for pity, carefully dressed as charity, for the specific discomfort of being made to feel grateful every time she entered a room. She had not prepared for a man who stated the terms of her welcome, with the same tone he might use to describe the weather. "Thank you," she said, and because she could not think of anything else that was true and also appropriate, she left it at that. Ethan was watching her from across the table, with the attentive expression of someone listening to music they had not heard before. When he saw her notice him watching, he did not look away. He simply picked up his wineglass and said, "I hope you like the manner, Miss Ashford. It takes a little time to learn, but once you know it, it is quite a good house." "Is it?" she said. "The east corridor is drafty in winter," he said, "and the morning room gets no sun at all, which is a genuine design failure. But the library is very fine, and the kitchen garden is better than anything you will find within 50 miles. "Ethan grows things," Callum said. I do, Ethan agreed, without any embarrassment. I find it satisfying. She thought of the man she had seen from the window, crouching in the cold in his shirt sleeves, throwing a handful of weeds over the garden wall with the expression of a man who had won something. I saw you in the garden when I arrived, she said. Ethan looked pleased, as though being spotted at something he enjoyed was a form of compliment. Then you've had the full tour already. Callum set his napkin on the table. You must be tired from your journey, Miss Ashford. We will not keep you from resting. There will be time to know each other better. He said this in the voice of a man making a statement of fact, not an offer, not unkindly, but not warmly either. She stood when they stood, said good night in the correct way, and walked back through the corridors to her room. Clara was waiting up for her, which Marin told her not to bother with next time. She undressed and got into the bed with its green curtains and lay on her back staring at the ceiling. The fire in the room had burned down to embers. The house was quiet, the deep, settled quiet of a building with thick walls that had stood for a very long time and had no intention of falling down. She thought about what Callum Caldwell had said. It is simply what is right. She thought about Ethan Caldwell, who grew things in the cold and left flowers in rooms for women he had not met. She thought about the plan, the careful, sensible plan to be polite and manageable, and to find a way out of this as quickly and cleanly as possible. It was a good plan. She closed her eyes. She was still holding the plan when she fell asleep, but it was already, without her knowing it, beginning to develop small cracks at the edges, the way all plans do when they make contact with actual people. Outside, the garden was dark and still. The rose bushes stood in their bare rows, waiting for spring, which was not coming yet but was, somewhere, already decided. The fountain at the front of the house did not run. The water in its basin sat perfectly flat and perfectly quiet, and the stars that appeared between the breaking clouds were reflected in it, small and sharp and clear, like something that had been lost a long time ago and had finally found its way back to the right surface. She had been at Caldwell Manor for 6 days before she understood the rhythm of the house, and another 2 before she understood the rhythm of its men. Callum Caldwell rose at 6. She knew this because she had also risen at 6 on the second morning, unable to sleep, and had come downstairs to find the library already lit and the remains of a cup of coffee on the desk beside the window. He was not in the library when she arrived, but he had clearly been there, and recently, the chair was still turned slightly toward the window rather than the desk, the way a chair is left when a person has been sitting in it, looking out rather than working. She had looked at that chair for a moment, then taken the opposite armchair and opened the book she had brought down with her, and sat quietly until it was light enough to see the garden. Ethan rose at 8, or sometimes 9, and immediately went outside. This she had established by watching from her window, which she told herself she did for no particular reason other than that it faced the garden. He moved through the kitchen garden and the formal garden and the small orchard beyond it, with the easy authority of someone who knew every inch of a place and felt no need to hurry through it. He checked things, adjusted things, occasionally crouched down and looked at the ground with an expression of focused interest. Once she saw him stand very still for several minutes, watching a bird she could not identify from where she stood. They met at breakfast, all 3 of them, at 8 sharp. This appeared to be the one fixed social event of the day. Dinner was the other. Between those 2 points, the day was her own. She had not had a day that was her own in 3 months. The period following her father's death had been entirely occupied, first with the grief that she had not allowed herself to feel in front of anyone, and then with the practical devastation of sorting through what remained, which turned out to be very little. Solicitors and creditors and well-meaning neighbors, and the endless series of decisions that arrive when a household dissolves. She had been busy every single day, and she had been grateful for it, because busyness is a kind of armor, and she had needed armor. Now she had time. She used it, at first, to read. The library at Caldwell Manor was genuinely excellent, large, well-ordered, with a range that suggested several generations of people with varied interests. There were histories, and natural sciences, and philosophy, and a long run of novels along the southern wall that included titles she had been meaning to read for years. She worked through them steadily, sitting in the armchair she had now begun to think of as hers, and this was fine. This was manageable. On the 4th day, Callum came into the library while she was there. He did not seem surprised to find her. He moved to the desk by the window, sat down, and opened a ledger he had brought with him. He did not say good morning, which initially seemed like an oversight, and then, after a few minutes, seemed like something else. A kind of courtesy, actually. A permission to be in the same room without performing sociability. She kept reading. He kept working. After perhaps 40 minutes, he said, without looking up, "There is a section on the far wall, geography mostly, that has several very good accounts of India and the Far East, if that interests you." She looked up. "Why would it interest me?" He glanced at her then. "I don't know. It interests me. I thought I would mention it." She found this, for reasons she did not examine, rather disarming. She said, "Thank you, I'll have a look," and returned to her book, and he returned to his ledger. That was the first real conversation they had. It lasted approximately 45 seconds. Ethan's conversations were different. They arrived without warning, were longer than expected, and left her feeling that she had been in a brighter room than the one she had entered. He had a way of talking about things he was interested in: the garden, the tenants on the estate's farmland, a book on botany he was working through, with such complete and unguarded enthusiasm that it pulled you in even if you had not been remotely interested in the subject beforehand. On the 5th morning, she came down to breakfast and found him already at the table with a muddy trowel sitting on the edge of his plate, which he had apparently forgotten to put down before sitting. "You are going to get dirt in your eggs," she said. He looked down at the trowel. "I was going to put it somewhere. There wasn't an obvious place." "The hall table." "The hall table has a vase on it. Put it beside the vase." He considered this. "That seems wrong. It does not seem half as wrong as a trowel next to your breakfast." He laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and put the trowel on the windowsill, which was also not the correct place for it, but was at least not on the table. Clara, who was pouring the tea, made no expression whatsoever, which was its own kind of comment. Maren sat down and took her tea, and thought that she had not made anyone laugh in a long time. Not a real laugh. Not the accidental kind. She moved this thought to one side. The days continued. She found her way into routines. The library in the morning, a walk in the early afternoon regardless of weather because she needed the air and the movement, and then the careful ritual of dinner each evening, where she slowly, over the course of many small exchanges, began to understand who these two men were, beneath the version of themselves that they presented to a woman they had not yet decided to trust. Callum, she learned, ran the estate with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He met with the estate manager every other day. He reviewed accounts himself rather than delegating them entirely. He knew the names of the tenants on every farm, not just the head of each household but their children, their problems, which fields had flooded in the autumn rains, which barn roof needed replacing before winter set in. This was not performed obligation. She could see it in the way he talked about these things, briefly, practically, without sentiment, but with a precision that only comes from genuine attention. Ethan, she learned, was not what she had initially taken him for. The ease was real, and the warmth was real. But beneath both of those there was a seriousness she had not expected, a kind of careful looking that he disguised behind lightness, the way a man might keep his best tool in a worn case. He was interested in things the way careful people are interested, not because something was fashionable or impressive, but because it mattered to him. The garden was one example. The tenants' children were another. He knew which of them needed books and had arranged, quietly, for books to be sent. She found out about this not from him, but from Mrs. Elton, who mentioned it without apparent awareness that it was notable. On the 6th evening, dinner went later than usual. The cook had made something complicated, and there had been a small disaster involving a cream sauce, which had been replaced with something quicker and less ceremonious, but actually better. Ethan had described the kitchen disaster in such vivid and funny detail that even Callum had stopped cutting his food and listened. The story involved the cook's assistant, a dropped ladle, and a cat that should not have been in the kitchen and was never satisfactorily explained. When the laughter had settled, Maren found herself looking at the table, the candlelight, the half-empty wine glasses, the easy quiet that had settled between the three of them, and feeling, to her considerable alarm, comfortable. She had not meant to feel comfortable. Comfortable was dangerous. Comfortable was what happened right before you stopped being careful, and she needed to be careful. She was here on terms that could change. She was here because someone had decided to be generous, and generosity was not a permanent condition. She had learned this clearly, in the month since her father died, when various people who had seemed warm and helpful at the funeral had become noticeably less available when it emerged that the help required was financial. She was not going to make the mistake of thinking she was home. But the candlelight was very warm, and the food was good, and Ethan was telling a story about something else now. A horse that had gotten into the orchard 2 summers ago and had subsequently developed very strong opinions about which apples it preferred. And even Callum was shaking his head with the particular expression of a man who has been exasperated by the same thing for 2 years and has begun to find it genuinely funny. She thought, I should be careful. And then she thought, I can be careful tomorrow. And she stayed at the table longer than she had planned. The next morning, she was in the library when Callum came in. She was not reading. She was sitting with a book open in her lap and looking out the window at nothing, which was what she did when she was thinking, and did not want anyone to know she was thinking. He sat at the desk and opened his ledger and said nothing. After a few minutes, she said, Your Grace. Yes. How long were you and your father on good terms with mine, before everything? There was a pause. She watched him put down his pen. He looked at her in the same way he looked at his accounts, not coldly, but directly, as though there was no particular reason to look anywhere else. They knew each other for perhaps 15 years, he said. They met through a mutual interest in a particular kind of horse breeding. My father was fond of your father. He found him entertaining. My father was entertaining, she agreed. He was also reliably disastrous with money. A pause. Yes, Callum said simply. My father was aware of that. And yet he lent him money. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. She waited, because she had learned in 6 days that Callum Caldwell was not a man who rushed toward an answer. Because your father asked, he said at last. And because he had a daughter, and my father was the kind of man who thought a great deal about what would happen to daughters when their fathers were gone. She sat with this for a moment. The old Duke of Caldwell, who she had never met, who had sat across a table from her father and known, probably, that the money was unlikely to return, and had given it anyway because he was thinking ahead to a girl who might one day have nowhere to go. She was not going to be emotional about this. She was especially not going to be emotional about this, in front of Callum Caldwell at 9 in the morning in his library. He sounds like a good man, she said. He was, Callum said, and picked up his pen. She opened her book. They sat in silence for another half hour, and the silence was not uncomfortable, and this was, she recognized, a small but genuine gift. She was still thinking about it when Ethan found her after luncheon, in the garden, standing with her coat pulled closed against the cold, and looking at the bare rose bushes along the far wall. They'll come back in April, he said, appearing beside her without announcement. I know roses come back, she said. Some people don't. They see them bare and think something is wrong. I grew up with a garden, she said. I know what bare looks like. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the feeling, not for the first time, that he was paying closer attention than the conversation seemed to require. Was it a good garden? It was lovely, she said, and then, because the past tense of it was suddenly very present, she said, the house had a walled garden at the back. It was my mother's project, originally. She planted it the year she and my father were married. Every spring it was. Extraordinary. Where is it now? Sold with the house. She looked at the roses. To someone who probably won't know what they have. He did not say anything consoling. She was grateful for that. People had said many consoling things in the past months, and they had all landed wrong. Too soft, too certain. As though comfort was a thing that could be placed over grief, like a cloth over a birdcage. Ethan simply stood beside her and looked at the rose bushes, and the silence between them was the right shape. After a while he said, I will show you what we have coming in spring, if you are here. The back border is quite good, and there is a climbing thing along the south wall that I have been nursing along for 3 years and it owes me. She looked at him. What kind of climbing thing? A rose, technically, but it has opinions. About what? Mostly about which direction I want it to grow versus which direction it wants to grow. She felt something shift slightly in her face. Not quite a smile. Close enough. And who is winning? We are at an impasse, he said gravely. It grows where it chooses. I tie it back. It grows there again. We have an understanding. This time she did smile. She could not help it. He saw it and looked pleased, in a way that was not performative, not the look of a man who had been trying to make her smile and was congratulating himself on the success of it. Just pleased, straightforwardly, simply pleased. She looked back at the garden. The wind moved through the bare branches of the small orchard beyond the wall. Somewhere behind the house a door closed. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and even, the kind of sky that meant weather by evening. She thought again, with the discipline of a woman who had learned to be honest with herself, even when she did not want to be. I should be careful. The cold was in her face, and the silence between them was warm, and she was standing in someone else's garden, looking at someone else's roses. And this man beside her was kind, and she was tired of being careful. She was going to keep being careful anyway. But it was getting harder. That was the 8th day. She did not yet know what the days after it would hold. She did not know about the evening in the corridor, where she would overhear something she was not meant to hear. Or the morning Callum would come into the library and not sit down. Or what would happen in the garden when the rain finally came. She did not know about the demand, or the choice, or the long night she would spend alone trying to understand which direction she was growing, and which direction she was only being tied. She knew none of this yet. She only knew that the rose bush to her left had a single dried bloom still clinging to it from the autumn, a small brown curl of something that had once been red, and that Ethan was looking at it too, and that Callum was somewhere in the house working, and that the three of them were, as yet, entirely separate people, moving in parallel lines that had not yet intersected. They would. The manor settled around them in the gray afternoon, and the fountain at the front did not run, and the walled garden of her mother's making was in the hands of strangers now, and Marin Ashford stood in the cold and was, without quite intending to be, still here. The rain came on a Wednesday. Not a polite rain, not the kind that drifts in gently and gives you time to get indoors. This came sideways, hard and cold, the sort of rain that finds every gap in a coat and makes the whole world feel slightly smaller. Marin had been walking in the back garden when it started, and by the time she had registered what was happening, she was already wet above the collar. She walked faster, then gave that up entirely and ran, because there was no dignified way to be soaked and she might as well get to the garden door before the ground turned to mud beneath her feet. She was 2/3 of the way there when she came around the corner of the stone wall at the edge of the kitchen garden and ran directly into something solid. Her hands went out to catch herself. One of them found an arm. A very solid arm. The collision drove all the breath out of her, and she staggered back half a step and looked up. Ethan. He had been coming in the same direction apparently, from the far end of the orchard, and he had been moving with more speed than elegance, and he was also already soaked, his dark hair flat against his forehead, rain running down his jaw. He had his hands out to steady her, and she realized, after a moment, that they were both still holding on. She let go first. "Are you all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "I didn't see you." "I didn't see you either." He looked at her, and something in his expression caught. Not alarm, not exactly, but something that paid very close attention. "You should go in. You are going to freeze." "So should you," she said. "You're as wet as I am. I know where my dry coat is." "And I don't know where mine is?" "You don't know where the garden door is," he said. "It's the other direction." She paused, looked over her shoulder. The door she had been running toward was, in fact, a wood store. He was right. She had been about to run into a building full of logs. She turned back to find him watching her with the expression of a man who very much wanted to laugh and was doing an admirable job of not doing it. "The door," she said, "is that direction." "It is," he agreed, with great seriousness. She walked past him. He fell into step beside her, which she had not asked for and did not object to, because the garden door was perhaps 30 yards away, and the rain had, if anything, intensified, and there was no good reason for either of them to be polite about getting out of it. They reached the door together. He pushed it open. It stuck, briefly, in the way of garden doors that have swollen with weather. And she went through first, and he came in behind her and pulled it shut, and they were inside the back passage. which was dim and flagstoned and smelled of wet earth and old wood, both of them dripping on the stone floor. She pushed her wet hair back from her face. He was looking at her, not in a way that was wrong, in a way that was very quiet, actually, and a little careful, the way you look at something you are trying to understand and are not sure yet that you should be looking at it at all. She said, "Thank you, for the door." He said, "You would have found it. Eventually. In approximately 20 minutes. 15. She said, "I am quite good at problem solving under pressure." He smiled. "I know," he said, which was a strange thing to say, because they had known each other for 11 days, and she had not given him any particular evidence of this. She looked at him for a moment, trying to decide if he was teasing her or not. His expression was level. He meant it. She was cold and damp and standing in a dim corridor, and she was unexpectedly, in a way she had not prepared for, aware of how close they were standing. She took a small step backward. "I should change," she said. "Before dinner." "Of course," he said. And then, because he was Ethan and could not seem to help himself, "The gray dress again?" She looked at him. "I have more than one dress. I know you do. You've worn 3 of them. The gray, the dark blue, and the green one last Tuesday." She stared at him. He had the grace to look slightly caught, not embarrassed exactly, more like a man who had said something out loud that he had only intended to notice privately. "You have been paying attention," she said. "I pay attention to most things," he said. "It is a habit." She held his gaze for a moment. The rain was loud against the passage's single small window. Water was running off the sleeve of her coat in a slow, steady drip. "Do you pay the same attention to everything?" she asked, "or only to some things?" A pause. Something shifted in his face, a small and definite shift, like the first movement of a thing that has been held very still. "Some things," he said. She nodded, as if this were perfectly ordinary information, and walked past him toward the stairs. She changed into the dark blue dress. She sat at her writing desk for a moment before going back down, not writing anything, just sitting. The fire was going, and her hair was drying in the heat of it, and she was telling herself, with the patient persistence of a woman who had told herself a great many things in the past months, that this was nothing. A man pays attention to the woman who lives in his house. This is normal. This is what people do when they share a space. He noted the dresses because she is there every day, and people notice what they see repeatedly. This is not significant. She is reading significance into ordinary things, because she has been isolated and lonely, and grief is a strange condition that makes small kindnesses feel enormous. She was very firm about all of this. She went down to dinner. Callum was already at the table, and something about his posture, the slightly too deliberate stillness of it, made her think he had been there for longer than necessary. He looked up when she came in. His gaze moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the door behind her, and she understood that he was noting Ethan's absence, and then noting that she had arrived at the same moment. She sat down. "Your Grace." "Miss Ashford." He looked at her for a moment. "You were caught in the rain this afternoon." "I was. I am completely recovered." "Good." He picked up his wine. "The gardens are better approached before noon, in this season. The weather turns in the afternoons." "I'll remember that." "Ethan knows the weather here very well. He could tell you the patterns." She looked at him. There was nothing in his voice, or his face, that was anything other than useful information, delivered helpfully, but she had a sudden, clear instinct that he was saying more than he was saying, and that the more he was saying was a question she did not yet know how to answer. She said, "He did, in fact, rescue me from the wrong door." "The wood store," Callum said, and this time something that was definitely a smile arrived, and departed in the space of half a second. "Everyone runs for it, at least once." "Did you?" "When I was 7, he said. "I was very annoyed about it." She smiled before she could stop herself. "And Ethan?" "Ethan has never run for the wrong door in his life," Callum said. "He has always known exactly where every door is." There was something in this, a tone, not quite pride, and not quite something else, that she filed away and looked at later, in her room, when the house was quiet. There were 2 people in this house who had been together their whole lives, and were now in the same rooms as a third person, who was still learning where the doors were. That was the shape of it. She needed to understand that shape clearly. Ethan arrived at the table 6 minutes late with no explanation, poured himself wine, said something cheerful about the rain, and the dinner moved on. And she watched Callum from the corner of her eye, and noticed that he watched Ethan too, in the way of an older brother who has long since given up being surprised, but has not given up paying attention. 3 people at a table, 2 of them who belonged there, 1 who was still deciding what belonging meant. The week that followed was quiet in the way that things are quiet before they change. She settled further into the rhythms of the house. The library mornings, the walks, the dinners. She helped Mrs. Elton with a small domestic problem involving the linen cupboard that was beyond the housekeeper's patience, but well within Marin's organizational instincts, and this seemed to shift something in Mrs. Elton's manner toward her. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of respect, which she preferred. She began to feel, cautiously and against her own intentions, less like a visitor. She had small conversations with Callum in the library that accumulated into something she could not quite name. Not a friendship, because friendship requires a certain lack of distance, and Callum had a distance built into him, the way some houses have high ceilings, as a feature rather than a flaw, but something, a connection made of shared quiet and occasional sentences, and the particular ease of being in a room with someone who did not require you to perform. She had longer conversations with Ethan that were easier to name, but harder to categorize. He came to find her, most days, in the garden, in the corridor, once in the library where he sat in the chair across from her and read for an entire hour without speaking, which she had not expected him to be able to do, and which impressed her more than anything he had said. When he finally looked up from his book and caught her looking, he said, "I can be quiet. I just don't always choose to be." "Why not today?" she asked. He looked at the window. The light was good. Clear afternoon light, after several days of cloud. "It's a good afternoon for reading," he said. "Some afternoons are." She thought about this. "You pay attention to that too, what kind of afternoon it is. Don't you?" She thought about the afternoons of the past year. The endless logistics of the past year. "I haven't been paying attention to much except what needed doing," she said. He looked at her. That look, the one she had begun to notice and not quite name. "You can now," he said. "You don't have to be anywhere in particular." This simple observation landed somewhere underneath her ribs. She did not let it show on her face. "I know," she said, and picked up her book. The rain came twice more that week. She learned the right door. And on the evening of the 16th day, a Sunday, cold and still, with a sky that had been the color of lavender at dusk, she came in from her afternoon walk to find Ethan, already inside, leaning against the wall of the back passage, as though he had been waiting there, or as though he had arrived at the same moment she had, and had not yet decided to move. He had something in his hand, a small sprig of something green. "Rosemary," he said, before she could ask. "From the kitchen garden. It flowers in spring, but the leaves are good now. You can smell it." He held it out. She took it. The smell of it was immediate and clean and familiar. Her mother's kitchen garden had grown rosemary along the path, and the scent of it had been part of every childhood afternoon she had ever spent outdoors. She had not smelled it in a very long time. She held it in both hands, and did not say anything for a moment. He said, quietly, "I thought you might like it." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, careful and open at the same time, which should have been contradictory, and was not. He had done this for her, this small thing, and he was watching to see if it had landed where he intended it to, which meant he had intended it carefully, which meant he had been thinking about her. She knew this. She could not pretend she did not know this. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He pushed himself off the wall and walked past her toward the stairs, and she stood in the passage with a sprig of rosemary in her hands, and a feeling she was not ready to give a name to, and the rain, that had started again outside, drummed against the window in the measured, patient way of something with all the time in the world. She set the rosemary on the windowsill of her room that night. Clara looked at it but said nothing, because Clara had been watching this household with the silent attentiveness of a woman who had spent 50 years reading the rooms she worked in, and she had decided, Marin was fairly sure of this, that watching was the correct approach for now. Marin sat by the small fire and thought about the sprig of rosemary and what it meant, or what she was allowing it to mean. And she thought about Callum's brief smile over the dinner table 2 nights ago, and she thought about the life she had planned, which had not included any of this. She had planned to be sensible. She had planned to be grateful and measured, and to make the best of a situation she had not chosen. She had not planned to find herself standing in a cold passage smelling her own childhood because a man with mud on his boots had thought she might like it. She had not planned for kindness, not the particular, attentive, specific kindness that arrived in the form of flowers in a bedroom and a sprig of rosemary, and a chair left facing the window, and a man who noted which dresses she wore, the kind of kindness that sees you. She was not used to being seen. She had been visible, for most of her life, in the way that daughters of charming and prominent fathers are visible, as reflections, extensions, supporting characters in someone else's story. She had been pretty, and well-mannered, and well-spoken, and she had existed, largely, in the service of an impression. She had been good at it. She had been so good at it that she had sometimes, in the quiet parts of her own mind, wondered if there was anything underneath the performance, or if the performance had simply become her. Here, at Caldwell Manor, there was no one for her to be an extension of. There was no impression to manage. She was simply a woman who had arrived with 2 trunks and a dead father's name, and no particular future, and the 2 men who lived here were treating her not as a character in their story, but as a person with her own. This was, it turned out, more difficult to handle than condescension would have been. She had armor for condescension. She did not have armor for this. She picked up the rosemary, held it, put it down. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Outside the window the rain continued, steady and unhurried, against the glass. The fountain at the front of the house did not run. The garden was dark, and the rose bushes were waiting, and somewhere in the house, 2 men were asleep, or not asleep, and she was here, in the middle of something she had not been able to see the shape of yet, holding her breath against the possibility that the shape, when it finally became clear, was going to be very difficult to walk away from. The kiss happened on a Tuesday, 22 days after she had arrived. She knew the exact day, because she had been keeping a private account of things in her head, the days she had been here, the conversations she had stored, the small shifts she had noticed, and catalogued with the care of someone who understood that details matter, even when, especially when, you cannot see yet what they are building toward. What she had not catalogued, and could not have anticipated, was that it would be the rain again, and Ethan again, and the back garden again, as if the world had decided that certain things required a specific setting, and was going to provide it regardless of anyone's plans. She had gone out at the wrong time. She did this occasionally, misjudged the weather, or misjudged her own desire for air, which sometimes outpaced her common sense. The afternoon had been pale and still when she left the house. By the time she had reached the far end of the garden, it had changed. She stood for a moment in the shelter of the garden wall, watching the rain come across the field beyond the orchard, moving like a curtain being drawn. She was going to get wet again. She was going to be annoyed at herself about this. She turned back toward the house. Ethan was coming toward her from the direction of the orchard. He had his coat on this time. He had apparently learned something from the previous week. But his hair was already catching the first edge of the rain, and he was moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had given up on outrunning it. "Wrong time again," he said when he reached her. "I was watching the weather coming in," she said. "It seemed far away." "It always does," he said. "It isn't." They were standing under the lean of the garden wall, which provided approximately no shelter, but felt slightly better than standing in the open. The rain was picking up. She could hear it on the stone, on the gravel path, on the broad leaves of something in the kitchen garden that she had never learned the name of. "We should go in," she said. "We should," he agreed. He did not move. She did not move either. This was because she would think about this later, more than once, and try to reconstruct it honestly. She was not sure she wanted to. She had been thinking about him. She had been spending considerable effort not thinking about him, which is not the same as not thinking about him. And she was standing very close to him in the shelter of a wall, while the rain came down, and the light was gray and flat and kind, and she was tired. She was tired of being careful. She was tired of the constant internal accounting. She was tired of managing the distance between what she felt and what she allowed herself to express, the way you manage the wick of a lamp, always trimming it back before it can give too much light. He was looking at her with that look, the careful, open one she had named to herself as his real face, the one underneath the brightness. And she was looking back, and the rain was loud, and then he said her name. Not Miss Ashford. Her name. Just her name. Marin. She had not heard her own name in some time. Clara said it occasionally, in private. No one else here used it. The Duke called her Miss Ashford. Even Ethan, in all of their conversations, had been careful about it, as though using her name was a step he was considering and had not yet taken. He had taken it now. She said, yes. She did not know why she said yes. It was not a response to a question. He had only said her name. But it felt like a response, and she said it, and he moved slightly. A small movement, a closing of the distance that was already small, and he kissed her. It was brief, not hesitant, but brief. The kind of kiss that is not an accident and is not a full statement either, but sits somewhere in between, in the territory of things that mean very much and are also irreversible. She did not pull away. When it ended, she was still standing in the same position, under the shelter of a wall that did not shelter, in a garden that was now properly wet, looking at him. He was looking at her. His expression was the same as it always was, open, attentive, but with something underneath it that she had not seen before, something that was not quite certain of itself, which on Ethan was unusual and therefore significant. She said nothing. He said nothing. The rain said a great deal, loudly, about everything. She turned and walked to the house, and she found the correct door on the first try, and she went inside and up the stairs and into her room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Her heart was going very fast. She was aware of this the way you are aware of weather, not with alarm exactly, but with the understanding that something had shifted and was going to require your attention. Clara was not in the room. This was fortunate. She sat on the edge of the bed for a considerable time. What she was doing, she realized, was trying to decide what had actually happened. Not the surface of it. She knew the surface of it. She had been there. She was clear on the facts. What she was trying to decide was what it meant. And what it meant, and what she was going to do with what it meant, were questions that she could not answer quickly or carelessly, because she was in this man's house, and she owed this man's family a debt, and she had nowhere else to go, and she could not afford to be wrong. She needed to think. She also needed to stop thinking, because thinking was making the moment larger and larger, until it was filling the whole room, and what she needed was to bring it down to its actual size, which she suspected was smaller than it currently felt. She went to dinner. Ethan was at the table when she arrived. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is uncertain what he will find, and what he found was her sitting down and unfolding her napkin and asking Clara, who was pouring, whether there was more of the bread from luncheon, because she had particularly liked it. Clara said she would check. Callum arrived 2 minutes later and took his seat and said good evening. The dinner was quiet, not uncomfortably so. Quiet in the way it sometimes was when all three of them were tired, when the conversation did not need to work, when the food was simply the food, and the candlelight was simply the candlelight. But she was aware, sitting between these two men, picking at her food, keeping her expression pleasant and her posture easy, that something had happened today that had changed something, and that while she was the only one at the table who knew what it was, she was not going to be the only one who knew it for long. Callum, she had learned, noticed everything. He said nothing at dinner. He asked her, toward the end of the meal, whether she had managed to get out before the rain, and she said she had been caught in it a little. Yes. And he said, as he sometimes did, that the afternoons were unpredictable this season. She agreed. Ethan said nothing. He ate his dinner and refilled his wine once, and said something very brief about the estate manager. And the dinner moved to its end, and they said good night, and separated. She was at the top of the stairs when she heard footsteps below. Light ones. Ethan's. He was not following her. She could hear that he had turned in the other direction, toward the east wing where his rooms were. She stood still for a moment at the top of the stairs, in the dim of the upper corridor, and listened to his footsteps move away. She thought, This is where it starts to get complicated. She thought. It was already complicated. You have only just noticed. She went to her room. Clara was there, turning down the bed, and Marin sat at the writing desk and tried to think of something to write, and could not. The rosemary was still on the windowsill. She had not moved it. She looked at it now with different eyes, the eyes of a woman who was beginning to understand that small gestures are sometimes the largest things in a room. She thought about Callum. This was, she admitted to herself in the privacy of her own mind, a necessary and overdue thought. She had been thinking about Ethan, as a phenomenon, as a complication, as a source of warmth she had not expected, and she had been thinking very little about his brother, who was the head of this household, who had taken her in, who was quiet in the way of deep water, and who she suspected, without yet having evidence, was paying more attention to everything than anyone knew. She did not know what she thought about Callum. This in itself was information. About Ethan she had feelings she could list and examine. About Callum she had observations, impressions, a sense of a person she had not yet arrived at. She knew he ran a good estate. She knew he was fair. She knew he was capable of being warmer than he appeared, in small flashes that were gone before you could fully register them. She knew that when he spoke about something he cared about, the stillness in him changed quality, deepened rather than broke, like a pool of water when the wind passes over it, and it becomes more itself rather than disturbed. She did not know how he looked at her when she was not looking at him. She had not caught him doing it. This was either because he did not look at her that way, or because he was very good at not being caught. She suspected the latter. She went to bed with these thoughts, unresolved, and lay in the dark with the fire going low, and the wind outside, and the house all around her. Its old walls, its settled weight, its two men in their separate rooms. And she thought that she had come here with no expectations, and had somehow, in 22 days, acquired a great many things she was going to have to sort out carefully. Morning came gray and cold. She was dressed and downstairs before 8, which was early enough that only the kitchen staff were moving. She went to the library. The chair by the window was already turned toward the view. She sat in her own armchair and looked at it. Callum's chair. He had been here already this morning, and had already left. The house was so quiet she could hear the clock on the mantel, and the distant sound of someone in the kitchen, and nothing else. She pulled her book from the shelf and opened it. She could not read. She sat with it open in her lap, and looked at the window, and thought about a kiss, in a garden in the rain, and a chair turned toward a view, and the two things were entirely different, and she could not make them connect, except that they were both here, in this house, in this morning, and they were both somehow about her. She was still sitting there, unread book in her lap, when the library door opened. It was not Ethan. Callum came in, saw her, stopped for one brief moment, and then moved to his desk, as he always did. She watched him cross the room. He set down the papers he was carrying, arranged them with the focused precision she had come to expect, and sat. He looked at her. "You are here early," he said. "I woke early," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was, as always, difficult to read, not closed, but layered, like a letter written over itself. She had been learning to look past the first layer, slowly, over 22 days, and what she was seeing in this moment, she was not sure she was reading correctly. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. He nodded. He looked at his papers. He said, after a moment, "It will be fine weather today, if you want to be in the garden. The mornings are better." "Thank you," she said. He began to read. She tried again to read her book. The clock on the mantel measured the morning. She was in this house between two men, and she had been kissed by one of them, and the other was sitting 6 feet away, and she was composed and polite, and entirely, thoroughly, extremely not fine. But she was very good at not fine. So she read her book, or she held it at least, and the morning moved around them both, unhurried, toward whatever it was moving toward. 3 days passed. She did not speak to Ethan privately. This was not entirely deliberate. The days had their natural shape, and there was no particular moment where the two of them were alone, and she made no effort to create one. She told herself this was sensible. She also knew that she was avoiding something, And she told herself that too, because honesty with yourself is the least you can do when you are avoiding something. Ethan, for his part, did not press. He was the same at breakfast, the same at dinner. Warm, easy, attentive, but with a quality beneath it now, a kind of waiting, that she felt without being able to point to any specific evidence of it. He was watching to see what she would do. She had not done anything yet. Callum, as far as she could tell, noticed none of this. She was not sure she believed this, but it was the most useful version of reality, and she was going to maintain it for as long as she could. On the fourth evening after the garden, she was coming downstairs for dinner when she heard voices below. 2 voices. She stopped on the landing, not quite in view of the hallway. "Nothing to worry about," Ethan was saying, and his voice was light, the way his voice always was, except that she had spent enough time listening to him now to know when the lightness was genuine and when it was a decision. "I am not worried," Callum said. His voice was even, as always. "I am paying attention. Those are different things." "And what does your attention tell you?" A pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. "That she is someone worth being careful with," Callum said. Silence. Then Ethan said, "Yes, she is." She stood on the landing and did not breathe. Below her, one of them moved. She heard the sound of a door, and then nothing, and she stood for another moment before she walked down the rest of the stairs and into the dining room. They were both already at the table. She sat down, unfolded her napkin, said good evening. Callum said good evening. Ethan said good evening. They ate dinner. She thought, with considerable, quiet intensity, about what she had heard. "She is someone worth being careful with," said by Callum, about her, to the brother who had kissed her. Not as a warning exactly, or not only as a warning, as something more like an acknowledgement, a placing of value. She did not know what to do with the fact that it mattered to her. She did not know, either, what to do with the way Ethan had answered. "Yes, she is," said in his own voice, stripped for a moment of all its usual ease. Just the truth, plain, and no more. She was someone worth being careful with. 2 men had arrived at this conclusion separately, and she was sitting between them at a candle-lit table, and the story she had told herself about this being a temporary arrangement with a clear end was beginning to sound, in the quiet of her own mind, very unconvincing. The letter arrived on a Friday. She knew it was for her, because Mrs. Elton brought it to the library herself, which was not the housekeeper's usual practice. Correspondence was normally left on the hall table. The fact that Mrs. Elton had brought it personally suggested that she had looked at the return address on the envelope and made a decision about its significance. The return address was from a solicitor in London, not the same firm that had managed her father's estate, a different one, with a name she did not recognize. She opened it at the desk she had begun to use for writing, the smaller one near the fireplace, away from Callum's desk by the window. The letter was from a cousin, second cousin, technically, on her mother's side, a woman named Harriet, who lived in Bath, who she had not seen since she was 14, and who she had last heard from in a brief and formal note of condolence at her father's death. Harriet had, apparently, become aware of Marin's current situation through the particular social network that carried information about women in difficult circumstances with extraordinary speed and reliability, and she was writing to extend an invitation. The invitation was to come to Bath, to live with Harriet and Harriet's husband, who was a solicitor of modest success and considerable respectability, in their house, indefinitely. Harriet wrote that it would be wonderful company, and that she had always felt they had not had sufficient opportunity to know each other, and that there was a perfectly serviceable room that was currently doing nothing useful, and that Bath, while perhaps not as exciting as London, was perfectly pleasant, and there were a great many nice people. Marin read the letter twice. She put it on the desk. She looked at it. It was what she had been waiting for. This was the exit. This was the version of the future she had told herself she would find. A proper arrangement, in a proper household, with a blood relation, rather than a stranger's charity. This was exactly what she should do. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her dress. She went to the window. The garden outside was clear and cold, bright with the particular quality of winter light that is very sharp and does not warm. Ethan was not in it. Callum was somewhere in the house. She could hear, faintly, the sound of him speaking with someone. The estate manager, perhaps, in one of the rooms below. She thought about Bath. Bath was perfectly fine. Harriet was perfectly nice. She had been, at 14, a slightly bossy girl with good intentions and an excess of opinions. And there was no particular reason to think she had become anything other than a slightly bossy adult with the same. Her husband, the letter suggested, was the sort of man who was sensible and quiet and caused no trouble. The house was adequate, the company was nice, the whole thing was perfectly, entirely, completely fine. She thought about the library and the morning quiet and the sound of Callum's pen on paper. She thought about Ethan in the garden, naming the rose that had opinions. She thought about the sprig of rosemary on her windowsill, which she still had not moved. She thought about the garden in the rain, and her name said in a voice that meant it. She thought about a conversation on a landing she had not been meant to hear. She went to find Mrs. Elton. "Mrs. Elton," she said, "if I wanted to speak with His Grace today, when would be a good time?" Mrs. Elton, who gave nothing away as a rule, gave away slightly more than usual. "He finishes with Mr. Bowen at noon, miss. He usually has a half-hour before luncheon." "Thank you." She did not go to see Callum at noon. She walked in the garden instead, in the crisp, cold morning, on the gravel path, and she thought. She thought with the thoroughness she applied to everything difficult, which was the thoroughness of someone who could not afford to get things wrong, and knew it. The question was not whether to go to Bath. The question was why she was hesitating about going to Bath, and whether the reasons for her hesitation were good reasons or simply feelings, and whether feelings were a sound basis for any decision in her current situation. She had decided, somewhere in the past 4 weeks, that this was a good house. She had decided this carefully, because she was not given to sentimentality, and she had arrived with her eyes open, and she had watched and measured and assessed. She had decided it based on evidence. The library, the flowers in the room before she arrived, the way Callum had told her, on the first evening, that she was not an obligation, the rosemary, the laughter at dinner, the conversation she had overheard on the landing. These were things, they were real things, they were not the fantasies of a lonely woman reading significance into ordinary kindness. Were they? She stopped on the path. Were they ordinary kindness? Was she a woman in an unusual situation, being treated with the decency that most people deserved and rarely received, and reading something more into it because she was unused to decency after a difficult year? She was rigorous. She applied the rigor now, cold and careful. Ethan had kissed her. That was not ordinary kindness. That was specific and deliberate, and he had known what he was doing. She was certain of this. Callum had said she was someone worth being careful with. That was not the way you spoke about someone you were merely sheltering out of duty. She was fairly sure of this. She was not entirely sure of this. The gravel crunched under her feet. The rose bushes were still bare, still waiting. The sky was pale and very blue. She went inside for luncheon. Both men were at the table. Ethan had been in the kitchen garden all morning, and his hands were slightly red from the cold. Callum had been working, and looked it, the slight tension at his jaw that appeared when he had been dealing with complicated matters, and had resolved them without quite resolving them. She sat down. She unfolded her napkin. "I received a letter this morning," she said. Both of them looked at her. She had spoken neutrally, without emphasis, and both of them heard something in it regardless, because both of them were, in their very different ways, paying close attention to her. "From my cousin in Bath," she said. "She has extended an invitation for me to come and live with her household." A pause. The clock on the mantel marked it. "Is that something you are considering?" Callum said. His voice was even. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I wanted to be transparent with you, since my being here since you have been very generous, and it seemed right to tell you." "You don't owe us transparency about your decisions," Callum said. "No," she agreed. "But I thought it was the right thing to do." Ethan had not said anything. She did not look at him. She felt him looking at her. "You are welcome to stay as long as you wish," Callum said. "You know this, but you are also entirely free to go. These are not competing positions." "I know," she said. She looked up then, and she caught Ethan's eyes. His face, for once, was not doing the brightness. It was doing the thing underneath it, the real attention, the real feeling. He held her gaze for a moment, and what she saw in it was not an argument, and was not a plea. It was just her name, again, without sound, just the fact of her, looked at directly. She looked away. Luncheon continued. The food was good. The window was bright. Callum talked about something to do with the estate boundary, and Ethan asked 2 questions, and she listened and contributed 1 observation, and the meal ended, and they went to their separate afternoons. She went back to the library. She took the letter out of her pocket and read it a 3rd time. Harriet's handwriting was decisive and slightly too large, the handwriting of a woman who had things to say and intended to say them clearly. The invitation was warm. The room was serviceable. Bath was pleasant. She looked at the armchair. She looked at Callum's desk. She looked at the row of books along the south wall, which she had been working through steadily, and was perhaps a 1/3 of the way through. She put the letter back in her pocket. She was going to think about this properly. She was not going to decide in a moment of feeling, up or down. She was going to take several days and examine it clearly. She was still telling herself this, with great conviction, on the evening of that same day, when Callum came to find her in the morning room. She was not used to being sought out by Callum. He appeared in rooms she was already in, or they arrived at the same places at the same times, but he did not, as a rule, come looking for her. She looked up from the book she was not quite reading when he came through the door, and she saw, immediately, that he had come deliberately. He stood for a moment in the doorway. He looked at her with the expression she had been slowly learning to read, the one that was not cold, was not distant, was layered. Then he came in, and he sat in the chair across from her, which he almost never did, and he looked at the fire for a moment. She waited. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course," she said. He looked at her. "Are you happy here?" The question was so simple and so direct that it caught her entirely off guard. She had expected something more oblique, more formal, something with a practical framework. Not this. She took a breath. "I think I am," she said. "I didn't expect to be." He nodded, as though this confirmed something, or perhaps as though it was simply the answer, and he was receiving it. "I ask," he said, "because I want you to make whatever decision is right for you, and I want you to know that it is a genuine freedom, not a polite freedom, not a freedom with a shape that makes one answer easier than another." She studied him. "Is there an answer you prefer?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire went between them. Then he said, very simply, "Yes." She did not ask which answer. She found she was not ready to ask that yet, but she filed it. Precisely, carefully, in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He stood. He said, "Good night, Marin," using her name for the first time. He used it the way a man would use something he had been holding very carefully, setting it down in exactly the right place. She sat alone in the morning room for a long time after he left. Ethan had kissed her in a garden and said her name like something kept too long in the mouth. Callum had sat across from her by firelight and told her, without quite telling her, that he wanted her to stay. She held both of these things, one in each hand, so to speak, and she looked at them, and she was no closer to knowing what to do with them, but she was very clear, now, on one thing. She was not going to Bath. Not yet. Not because she had made a decision, because she was not ready to leave before she understood what she was leaving. She was not ready to leave. The next morning, she wrote to Harriet. She thanked her warmly. She said the invitation was very generous. She said she was in the middle of making some decisions, and would be very grateful if she might have a little time before giving a proper answer. She sealed the letter and gave it to the footman, and felt, for the first time in a month, that she had done something neither careful nor reckless, but honest. Ethan found her afterward in the garden. He said nothing for the first minute. He walked beside her on the path while the cold air moved through the bare branches of the orchard, and she waited, because she had learned that his silence was a particular kind of language. Eventually he said, "You didn't go to breakfast." "I was writing a letter." "To Bath?" "To my cousin, yes." He walked another few paces. And I told her I need more time," Marin said. He was quiet. Not with relief. Not with triumph. She would have noticed either, and disliked both. Just quiet. Then he said, "All right." She looked at him. "That is all you have to say? That is all you need from me right now," he said simply. And this, more than anything he had done or said in 6 weeks, was the thing that set him most solidly in her understanding. Not the kiss, not the rosemary. This, the recognition that she needed room to think, and the giving of it without condition. She looked back at the path. The cold was in her face. "The rose bush," she said. "The one that has opinions. What about it? Show me where it is." He smiled and led her to the south wall, and there it was. A substantial, sprawling thing that was supposed to be climbing, but was clearly doing as it pleased, its canes reaching in at least 3 different directions with the confident disregard of something that had already won its argument. "It is magnificent," she said. "It is chaos," he said, with real affection. "Those are often the same thing," she said. He looked at her then. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the rose. The south wall was warm even in the cold, catching the pale winter light and holding it, and they stood there together for a while, and she thought about all the things that had been planted and were waiting, and about growth that does not go where you point it, and about the strange, unlooked-for comfort of standing beside someone who understood that some things needed to do what they needed to do. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she was here, in this garden, in this cold, with this particular chaos of a rose bush, and she was not in Bath, and this was, for now, enough. She had been at Caldwell Manor for 31 days, when the season began to change. Not fully, it was still winter, still cold, still the bare and gray time of year that asks you to trust that something is coming without giving you any visible evidence. But the light was shifting. Mornings were arriving slightly earlier. The angle of it through the library window was different by a few degrees, and that few degrees meant that by 11 o'clock, there was a bar of real sunlight across the floor that reached as far as the armchair. She noticed this because she spent a great deal of time in the library. She noticed other things too. The way Callum's hand moved to pull out her chair at dinner, not quite performing the gesture, but doing it with the thoughtless care of a man for whom some courtesies have become entirely instinctive. The way Ethan, when he described something from the garden, always turned slightly toward her mid-explanation, as though her reaction was the point of the description. The way, when she asked a question at dinner, both men answered, not over each other, but in sequence, adding to what the other had said, which was the habit of 2 people who had been talking to each other for their whole lives, and had found, without discussion, a way to include a third voice. She was part of the conversation. She had not arrived as part of it. She had been admitted to it, gradually, the way you are admitted to a country when you have been there long enough that the paperwork stops mattering. She thought, I should write to Harriet properly. She thought, I will write to Harriet properly. She thought this every day for 4 more days, and did not write the letter. She knew what this meant. She was not someone who left things undone when she had decided to do them. She was organized and precise and reliable, and the fact that this particular letter kept not being written was information, loud and clear, that she was choosing to ignore. She was choosing to ignore a great deal, she admitted to herself on the evening of the 35th day, sitting in her room by the fire, with the rosemary still on the windowsill. She was choosing to ignore what it meant that she looked for Callum's handwriting in the margins of the books she borrowed from his library. She was choosing to ignore what it meant that the first thing she did, every morning, was look out her window to see if Ethan was in the garden. She was choosing to ignore what it meant that she had, almost without noticing, started thinking of her chair in the library as hers, and her place at the dinner table as her place, and the cold back passage with the stuck garden door as a thing with private history. She was, in short, choosing to ignore the possibility that she had stopped wanting to leave. The fire burned low. The rosemary was dry now, brittle on its stem, but she could still smell it faintly when the room was warm. She was going to have to stop ignoring things. That much was clear. She was going to have to look at this, all of it, both of them, whatever this was, directly, and decide what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She would do this. She would do it clearly and honestly, and soon. Just not tonight. Tonight she put more wood on the fire, and picked up her book and did not go to sleep for a long time. And outside the house the year was turning slowly toward something she could not see yet, but could, if she paid attention, already feel. The gathering at Whitmore House was the social event of the winter season in that part of the country, and Marin had not known about it until 5 days before it happened. Mrs. Elton informed her, with the quiet efficiency of someone managing multiple schedules and factoring in new variables without being asked, that a formal dinner and evening at the neighboring estate would require an evening dress, and that she had taken the liberty of noting that Miss Ashford had not yet had occasion to wear one, and that if alterations were needed on anything she had brought with her, the sewing woman in the village could accommodate on short notice. Marin had a suitable dress. She had, when she packed her things from the old house, included one gown that was appropriate for evenings of exactly this kind. From some old instinct of preparedness, she was glad now she had not overruled. It was deep green, well made, and it fitted correctly. She asked Clara to press it, and said nothing else. What she thought privately was, she was going to a dinner with 30 or 40 people, standing between these two men, in a social setting for the first time, and all 30 or 40 of those people were going to observe them very carefully, and draw conclusions, and she was going to have to be absolutely composed the entire evening. She had been absolutely composed in far worse circumstances. She would manage. The evening was cold and clear, the sky full of stars in the way that very cold evenings sometimes are, with a brightness to them that makes the world look larger than it usually does. The carriage took them the 2 miles to Whitmore House, in perhaps 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, the 3 of them sat in the warm interior of the carriage, in something that was almost silence but not quite. Callum, looking out the window at the fields going by. Ethan asking Marin a question about whether she had ever been to any of the neighboring estates before tonight, and her saying no, and him giving her a brief description of the families they were likely to encounter, delivered with the affectionate irreverence of someone who has known everyone since childhood, and has no particular illusions about any of them. The Whitmore family themselves are very good, he said. Lord Whitmore is dull but kind. Lady Whitmore is neither dull nor kind, but she is interesting, which is better. There will be a colonel, somebody who will immediately want to talk about the war with anyone who will listen. There will be several daughters of various families who have reached the age of being presented to people, and this will result in a certain energetic quality in the room. And there will be a man named Mr. Dunbar who breeds horses, and will corner you near the drinks table within 15 minutes of your arrival, if you are not careful. What is wrong with Mr. Dunbar? She asked. Nothing at all. He is perfectly pleasant. He is merely very interested in horses, and assumes everyone else is equally interested in horses. Callum, without looking away from the window, said, Ethan once talked to Mr. Dunbar about horses for an hour and a half, and then required a full day of recovery. I did not require a full day. You were in the garden by 7 the next morning, which is not your habit. I find the garden restorative. You were restoring. Marin was looking between them, and this exchange, light, quick, long practiced, was so clearly the language of 2 people who had been finishing each other's sentences for 20 years, that she felt, for a moment, very much outside it. She was not outside it, that was the thing. She had been welcomed in. But she was aware, in this particular moment, in this particular carriage, that she was also looking at something she was not quite part of, and that this was important to know. Whitmore House was large and lit from every window, warm squares of yellow against the dark. The carriage stopped at the entrance. The door was opened, and they went in, and the evening settled around her. She was introduced, variously, as Miss Ashford, and as a guest of the Caldwells, and occasionally, as a particular friend of the family, which she suspected was Mrs. Elton's phrasing, passed down through whatever chain of social communication had preceded their arrival. She received these introductions with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her whole life in drawing rooms and had no trouble meeting strangers, and she made the correct remarks and asked the correct questions and smiled at the correct moments. She also, because she could not entirely help it, watched. She watched how Callum moved through the room. He was not, as she might have expected, uncomfortable in company. He was simply the same as he was in his own house, which is to say controlled and attentive, and not particularly at ease, but in a way that people seemed to find authoritative rather than cold. Several men sought him out, specifically to speak to him. He listened more than he spoke, but when he spoke, people leaned in. She watched how Ethan moved through the same room. and was struck, again, by the difference. Where Callum was a fixed point, Ethan was a current. He moved easily from person to person, genuinely delighted to see some of them, genuinely fond of the children who were making a brief appearance before being removed upstairs, genuinely interested in the old woman near the fireplace, who nobody else appeared to be talking to, and who turned out to have a great deal to say about the history of the country house they were standing in. She met Lord and Lady Whitmore. Lord Whitmore was, indeed, kind. Lady Whitmore was sharp-eyed and clever, and looked at Marin for approximately 4 seconds, before making some rapid internal assessment, and becoming warmer, in a way that suggested the assessment had been favorable. "You are staying at Caldwell Manor," Lady Whitmore said. "I am," Marin said. "Both brothers in the house at once," Lady Whitmore said, with the air of someone making an observation rather than a comment. "That must be lively." "It is a very pleasant house," Marin said. "I have no doubt," Lady Whitmore said, and smiled. She danced. She had not expected to dance. She had not danced in over a year, and she had not particularly been looking forward to it. But the evening had music, and a cleared floor, and the atmosphere of a gathering, where not dancing felt conspicuous. So she danced. Ethan asked her for the first one, and she had known he would, and she accepted, and they moved through the figures of it with the ease of two people who have been in each other's company long enough that physical proximity is not a surprise. He was a good dancer. She had not expected this either, though she was not sure why. He moved well. He was well coordinated. He was accustomed to his own body. He danced the way he did everything, with a kind of uncomplicated enjoyment. "You look as though you are having a better time than you expected," he said, during one of the moments the dance brought them close. "I am having a perfectly adequate time," she said. "You are having a good time," he said. "You are smiling." "I smile frequently." "You smile carefully, frequently." "This is different." He turned her through the next figure. "This is the smile that happens before you can decide about it." She looked at him. They were at opposite ends of the floor for a moment, and then the dance brought them back together, and when they were close again, she said, "You pay too much attention." "You have said this before," he said. "I say it, because it is true." "You pay the same kind of attention," he said. "You have simply decided it is appropriate for you and not for me." She had no answer to this. It was too accurate. She chose not to answer it, and the dance moved into its closing figures, and then it was done, and they separated, and she went to find a glass of something, and stood near the window, and was grateful for the cool of the glass against her hand. Callum appeared beside her. Not suddenly. He had been in her peripheral vision for a moment before he arrived, moving across the room with the same quiet purposefulness he always had. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Lady Whitmore is excellent." "She is," he agreed. "She has been telling people what to think in this part of the country for 30 years, and she is usually right." "What did she think of me?" He looked at her, a pause. "She told me you had good sense," he said. "And you told her?" "That she was correct." She looked at the room, the candles, and the music, and the 30 or 40 people, the daughters, and the colonel, and Mr. Dunbar, who was in fact cornering someone near the drinks table at that very moment. "Is this what your evenings were like before I came?" she asked. "Occasionally," he said. "They were quieter." "Quieter than this?" "Than the house," he said. "The evenings like this were the same. The house was quieter." She understood what he was saying, or she thought she did. She filed it. They stood together for a moment, not speaking, watching the room. It was a comfortable silence. She had become familiar with his silences. They were one of the things she liked about him, the fact that he did not fill air for the sake of it. Ethan found them after another quarter hour and announced that Mr. Dunbar had been redirected toward the colonel, who was unexpectedly interested in a specific breed of cavalry horse, and that this alliance was paying dividends for everyone in a 12-foot radius of the drinks table. Callum said, "Well done." Ethan said, "I know how to manage a room." Marin said, "You both do, in entirely different ways." They looked at her, then at each other, then back at her. "That is," Ethan said, "the most diplomatically accurate thing anyone has said about us in my recent memory." "It is accurate," Callum said. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to watch for. Quiet, layered, paying attention. She pays attention. She does, Ethan said, and there was something in his voice she did not quite catch. Not quite agreement, not quite something else. She stood between them, and looked at the room, and the music played, and the candles moved in their holders, and the party continued around them, and she thought, this is the picture. This is what it looks like from the outside. A woman, standing between two men who are both watching her, in a room full of people who are going to go home tonight and talk about it. She thought, I am going to have to do something. Eventually. About all of this. She thought, not tonight. The carriage home was quiet. Ethan fell asleep, or appeared to, his head against the window, eyes closed, the rise and fall of his chest steady. Callum sat across from her, not sleeping, looking out at the dark fields. She looked out the opposite window. The stars were still there, bright and cold. The road was smooth. Somewhere behind them, Whitmore House was still lit, its windows still warm, and Lady Whitmore was still in it, being sharp and right about things. Maren thought about what Lady Whitmore had called her, good sense. She had always been told she had good sense. She had always tried to use it. She was not sure, right now, in this carriage, with these two men, that she had any sense at all. But she was still here. The burrito was cold, the galaxy learned true fear. The burrito was cold, the stars kept the window company all the way home. She did not sleep well that night. Not because anything was wrong, exactly. Because too much was right, or almost right, or close enough to right to be frightening. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, and listened to the house settle around her. The sounds that had become familiar in 6 weeks. The specific creak of the east corridor. The way the wind found the chimney on cold nights, and made a low, almost musical sound in it. She had been in this house for 38 days. She had arrived with a plan and no feelings, and now she had feelings and no plan. She was a woman of 23, with no money, no home of her own, no family, except a second cousin in Bath who had good intentions and a serviceable room. She was dependent on the generosity of men she had not chosen and had not been chosen by in any deliberate sense. She was here by inheritance, by debt, by the accident of fathers and old agreements, and a dead duke who had thought ahead about daughters. And she was lying in a warm bed in a good house listening to a chimney singing in the wind, and two men were somewhere in the same house, asleep or not asleep, and she did not know what she was going to do. The question that kept arriving, in the dark, in the small hours when everything gets louder, what did she want? Not what was sensible, not what was manageable, not what would be wise given her circumstances, or appropriate given her position, or logical given the facts. What did she actually want? She had spent the past year not asking herself this. It had not been a useful question. When your life is collapsing, what you want has no bearing on what you do, and you simply do what needs doing, and you are grateful for the numbness that useful busyness provides. But the busyness had stopped. She was here, in the quiet, in the dark, and the question was still waiting. She tried to answer it honestly. She wanted, and this was the thing she had been circling for weeks without saying it plainly, even to herself. She wanted to be here, not in the abstract sense of having a safe place. She wanted to be here, specifically, in this house, with these particular mornings, and these particular conversations, and these two particular men. She wanted the library, with the bar of winter sunlight across the floor. She wanted the garden wall in the rain. She wanted the dinner table with its candlelight and the particular, easy warmth that had grown between the three of them over these weeks. She wanted both of them, she admitted, and then she stopped, because that was not a thought you were supposed to have, and she did not know yet what to do with it. She had been kissed by one of them, and had stayed in the same house, and was now lying in the dark wanting the whole thing, the books and the garden and the silences and the laughter. And she knew, with the clarity that only arrives at 3 in the morning when you stop pretending, that she was not going to Bath. She was not going to Bath because she did not want to leave, and she was not going to leave, and she was going to have to be very honest, very soon, about what that actually meant for all three of them. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Tomorrow. She would be clear about it tomorrow. She was asleep before she finished the thought. In the morning, she came downstairs to find both men already at breakfast, which was unusual. They rarely overlapped at exactly the same time, and she had arrived at her usual hour of 8, and both of them were there. Callum with his coffee and his customary stillness. Ethan with a piece of bread and a look of early morning enthusiasm that she had never quite been able to understand because she was not herself enthusiastic in the mornings. They said good morning. She sat down. Clara poured her tea. Callum said, without preamble, "There is something I would like to discuss with you. Both of you." Ethan looked up. Maren wrapped both hands around her teacup and waited. Callum said, "Not at breakfast. This evening, after dinner." He looked at Maren, then at Ethan. "All three of us." Neither of them spoke. "All right," Ethan said. "Of course," Maren said. Callum nodded and returned to his coffee, and that was that, and the morning continued, and she spent the rest of the day trying very hard not to think about what after dinner might mean. She failed at not thinking about it. She was in the library all morning, and she read approximately 8 pages in 5 hours. She walked in the garden at noon, and noted that the light was changing, warmer, slightly, angling different, and a green thing in the kitchen garden that she had not noticed before was showing small new shoots at its base. She stood and looked at them for a while, signs of something returning. She was going to sit across from Callum Caldwell after dinner, and she did not know what he was going to say, and she was fairly certain that Ethan did not know either, and the three of them were going to be in the same room, with all the unspoken things between them, and something was going to change. She went inside. She changed for dinner. She looked at herself in the glass and told herself to be steady, and she was steady. She always was. She went down. Dinner was uncomfortable in the way of things that are going to be important. Not overtly uncomfortable. The food was what it always was. Good. Simply prepared. The product of a kitchen that knew its business. The candles burned. The wine was poured. They talked about reasonable things. Ethan said something about the new shoots in the kitchen garden. Callum said something about a letter he had received from the estate's banker. Maren said something about a passage she had read that morning, which she had liked but which she was now unable to accurately remember because she had not been reading. She had been waiting. The dinner ended. Mrs. Elton cleared. The candles burned lower. Callum said, "Shall we go to the sitting room?" They went to the sitting room. It was the room off the dining room, smaller, with deep chairs, and a fire that had been built up. Someone had anticipated a longer evening, which meant Callum had requested it, which meant he had been thinking about this carefully. She sat in the chair nearest the fire. Ethan took the one across from her. Callum remained standing for a moment, which was the posture of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was organizing it into its correct order. Then he sat. He looked at her, then at Ethan, then at her again. "I am going to say something that is difficult to say," he said, "and I am going to say it plainly, because I think plainness is more respectful than approaching it sideways." She looked at him. She kept her hands still in her lap. "I am aware," Callum said, "that my brother has feelings for you. I am aware because I know him, and I know the difference between the way he is with people generally and the way he is with you specifically, and they are different." He paused. "I am also aware that the situation in this house is one that requires honesty, from all three of us, if it is to be managed well." Ethan was very still. This was extremely unusual for Ethan. Callum looked at his hands for a moment, which was the only visible sign that this was costing him anything. Then he looked at Maren. I find that I am not a disinterested party in this. I want to be honest about that. I have been less honest about it than I should have been, and I think that has not served any of us." Silence. The fire moved. The candle on the mantel dripped one drop of wax onto the holder, which she watched, because watching a specific small thing was the way she steadied herself when larger things were happening. Ethan said, "Callum." "Let me finish," Callum said, not harshly. Ethan let him finish. "We cannot continue as we are," Callum said. "All three of us in the same house, with all of us aware of what is not being said. It is not fair to you." He looked at Maren. "And I think you know it is not fair to you. You are in a position where you are dependent on our household, and that is not a position from which you can make a free decision, and I want to change that." She was listening very carefully. She was listening to the words, and she was listening to what was underneath the words, and what she was hearing was a man who had thought about this from the outside in, from her position, not his own, who had, as his first concern, the question of whether she was free. She said, "What do you mean when you say you want to change that?" Callum said, "I have spoken with the solicitors about your father's estate. The arrangement that brought you here, the debt, the accommodation, I want it resolved formally, independently. I want you to have resources of your own, from a settlement that is separate from any personal considerations, so that whatever you decide, you are deciding from a position of freedom." She stared at him. "That is," she said, very carefully, "an extraordinary thing to offer." "It is what should have been done immediately," he said. "I should have done it before now. I did not, and I am not entirely sure why I did not, and I am not proud of that." She understood why he had not done it. She thought he understood too. If she had had resources of her own from the start, she might have left. She might have had choices that led her elsewhere. And he had not done it immediately, and something in his face said he knew this about himself, and was not pleased about it. Ethan said, "Callum, you didn't." He stopped. He ran his hand over his face. He was, she realized, deeply affected by this, not because it was wrong, but because it was his brother being generous and honest in a situation where Ethan himself had complicated things, and he was holding both of those things at once. "I know," Callum said. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who has been the older brother his whole life and knows exactly what it costs. Maren sat between them and understood, for the first time, what the shape of this actually was. These two men who had been in each other's orbit their entire lives, who moved through the same house and spoke the same shorthand, and had spent decades learning each other's rhythms, she had arrived, without invitation, into the middle of all that, and something had shifted, and both of them had felt it, and neither of them had said anything to each other, until tonight. She said, "May I ask you both something?" They both looked at her. "Did you speak to each other about this? Before tonight, I mean." A pause. "No," Ethan said. "A little," Callum said. "At the same time." She looked between them. Ethan said, "We spoke briefly. Before you came down the other day, I mentioned that I told him that I had feelings for you." He said this plainly, without embellishment, which was unusual enough that she felt its weight. "And," she said. "And I told him the same thing I have told you," Callum said. "That you are someone worth being careful with." She sat with this. Then she said, "And what does careful mean to both of you?" Callum said, "It means not putting you in a position where you have to choose between your security and your own heart." She looked at Ethan. Ethan said, "It means not asking you for something when you might feel you owe it." She breathed. These were not the answers she had expected. She had prepared herself, in the hours before this evening, for several versions of this conversation. She had prepared for Callum to be formal and cool, and to lay out a set of practical terms. She had prepared for Ethan to be warm and a little chaotic, and to say something that was kind, but not quite considered. She had not prepared for two men who had, separately and together, arrived at the same priority, which was her freedom. She was not used to this. She had grown up in a household where she was managed, lovingly, in the way of a father who loved his daughter, and also lived his life in a way that didn't always account for her needs. She had grown up learning to be accommodating, because accommodation was the price of peace, and she had paid it so long and so fluently that she had sometimes forgotten she was paying it. These two men were telling her she did not have to. She was not going to be emotional about this in front of them. She had a very strong constitution regarding emotional displays in front of people, and she was applying it now, and it was not easy. "I need to tell you something," she said. They waited. "I have been offered a home in Bath," she said, "by my cousin. I told her I needed time, but I have not answered her properly, because I did not want to answer her, because I did not want to leave, and I have not been entirely honest with myself about why I did not want to leave." She looked at the fire. "I am going to be honest now." Callum was very still. Ethan was watching her with an expression she could not categorize. "I do not want to leave," she said, because this house has become, because both of you have become." She stopped, took a breath, started again. I came here expecting obligation and distance. I found something I was not looking for. I found I found a place that felt, against all my intentions, like something I wanted to be part of. Silence. I am not, she said, in a position to tell you who I feel more for, or what I want to do about any of it. Not tonight. I need time that is genuinely mine, and I think you have just offered me that, and I need to actually take it. She looked at Callum. The offer you have made, the formal settlement, I am grateful. I will accept it. And then I will decide, from that place of actual freedom, what I want to do. Callum said, that is exactly right. Ethan said nothing, but he nodded. She stood. They both stood, as they always did. Thank you, she said, for being honest, both of you. She went to bed. She lay in the dark, and the fire burned low, and the wind was in the chimney again, and she thought that she had just sat in a room with two men who had said, we want you to be free, even if freedom costs us. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who also wanted you to have room to see yourself. She thought about the plan she had arrived with, which was gone now beyond recovery, and she thought about what was replacing it. Not a plan. Something more like a beginning. She was not afraid of it. She had thought she would be afraid of it. When this moment came, she was not. She was very wide awake, and the house was all around her, and she was still here, still in the middle of something she had not expected, and she did not know how it was going to resolve. But she was not afraid. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Outside, the season was moving. The light was changing every day now, by fractions, accumulating. The garden was about to start returning to itself. The rose with opinions was going to put out its first new growth within weeks, climbing wherever it chose. She was going to find out what she chose. That was enough. For tonight. That was, she thought, turning on her side toward the window. Enough. She did not sleep as quickly as she had expected to. The conversation in the sitting room played back through her mind in pieces, not in disorder, but in the particular sequence of things that have mattered, as though her mind was sorting them into their correct places. Callum's voice, even and careful, saying, it is not fair to you. Ethan's voice, stripped of its usual ease, saying, I told him I had feelings for you. The fire between them, the candle dripping. She had been managed with great care her whole life. Not unkindly. Her father had loved her. But management is management, even when it comes from love. You were placed where you were needed. You were considered within someone else's framework. You were the daughter, the guest, the dependent, the ward, the person the situation was happening to. Tonight, for the first time she could clearly remember, she had been placed in charge of a situation that involved her. These men had put it in her hands. Not because they had no preference. They had both made it clear they had preferences, and that those preferences involved her staying. They had put it in her hands despite their preferences. This was not small. She had known, somewhere underneath all the careful accounting she had been doing for 6 weeks, that the question of Ethan and the question of Callum were not the same question. Ethan was warmth and attention and the particular pleasure of being noticed. Callum was something harder to name, quieter, deeper, the kind of thing that does not announce itself and is therefore easy to overlook until you turn around one day and discover it has been there the whole time, holding something up. She had noticed both. She had been trying, until now, to treat them as separate observations. The evening in the sitting room had made this impossible. They were not separate. They were two parts of the same decision, and the decision was hers. She thought, what do I actually know about love? This was a fair question. She was 23. She had been fond of people. She had admired people. She had had one early attachment, when she was 18, to a young man who had been perfectly agreeable, and had moved away to Edinburgh, and the whole thing had dissolved without drama or grief, and she had learned very little from it, except that agreeable was not the same as interesting. She did not know, with certainty, what love looked like in practice. She knew it in theory. She knew it from books and from watching her parents when her mother was alive. Not the romantic story of it, but the daily version. The version that was choosing someone on an ordinary morning and finding that the choice held. She thought about Ethan in the mornings, choosing to go outside. She thought about the way he had sat in the library for an entire hour without speaking, and how that had mattered. She thought about her name in the rain. She thought about Callum turning his chair toward the window and not explaining why. She thought about "Good night, Marin," said in a voice that had been holding the name a long time before it said it. She thought about sitting between them at Whitmore House, standing between them in a carriage going home, and feeling not divided but enclosed, not trapped, but held in some kind of attention from both sides that she had not had before and had not known to want. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She needed to stop thinking about this tonight. She needed to sleep. She needed the morning, which would be cleaner, less charged, easier to think in. The morning was going to come. Things always looked different in the morning, more specific, stripped of the particular electricity that the dark and the fire and the sitting room had put into everything. In the morning she would think clearly. She made herself be still. She made herself breathe. She counted the sounds of the house, the chimney, the floorboard in the corridor that always creaked when the temperature changed, the very distant sound of something in the kitchen that had no business being there at this hour, and was probably the cat that appeared periodically, despite having no known owner. The cat, she thought. She had never learned the cat's name. She had seen it twice in the hallway, and once on the kitchen windowsill, and she had not asked. She was going to ask tomorrow. She was going to ask Ethan, who probably knew, or Mrs. Elton, who definitely knew. This small and entirely irrelevant thought did what thoughts like that sometimes do, which is bring things back to their right size. The house was the house. The men were the men. She was herself. Tomorrow was tomorrow. Things had been said that needed to be said and would not unsay themselves, but they also did not require an answer tonight. She breathed. She slept. She dreamed of the garden, not this garden, but the walled one from her childhood, the one that had been her mother's project, the one with the rosemary path, and the deep borders, and the particular quality of light it had in late spring, when everything was too full and too green, and the air smelled like something that was about to become a memory. She walked through it, and it was intact, and it was hers, or it was no one's, or it was simply itself, existing the way good gardens exist when no one is looking, continuing, quietly, entirely. When she woke, the room was full of gray morning light. The fire had gone to cold ash. She lay for a moment, perfectly still, with the remnant of the dream still around her like a scent that stays after the source is gone. She thought, all right. She thought, one thing at a time. She got up. She washed her face in the cold water. She dressed. She looked at the rosemary on the windowsill, which was completely dry now, a small, fragile curl of brown. She picked it up. She turned it in her fingers. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She went downstairs. The library was empty. The dining room was empty. She went to the kitchen and startled the cook, who was not expecting her at this hour, and she asked for tea and bread, and the cook provided both without ceremony, and she sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, not the library, at the plain kitchen table, with her tea and her bread, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of fire and flour, and she sat there for a long time, before anyone else came down. She was going to think clearly. She was going to use the next days, however many she needed, to think clearly. She was going to make this decision honestly, from freedom, the way both men had asked her to. The tea was good, the bread was warm, the kitchen was exactly the right place to be at 7 in the morning, when everything was still very open and nothing was yet decided. She would decide. She would look at this honestly. She would know what she wanted, and she would say it plainly, because plainness, as Callum had said, was more respectful than approaching things sideways. She would be plain. Not today, but soon. She wrapped both hands around the tea. Soon. 4 days. That was how long it took her to stop pretending she was still deciding. She had told herself she needed time, and she had meant it. Genuinely. Not as evasion. And she had used the 4 days honestly. She had walked a great deal. She had read very little. She had sat in the kitchen at 7 in the morning twice more, because the kitchen was good for thinking, and Mrs. Elton had found her there on the second morning and had simply poured her more tea without comment, which was the right response. She had thought about Ethan. She had thought about every version of Ethan she had observed in these weeks, the man in the garden, the man at the dinner table, the man in the library reading quietly for an hour, the man who had said her name in the rain. She had thought about the kiss, which she did not regret, and had not regretted, and she had thought about what had followed it, which was 6 weeks of him not pressing her, not asking, not requiring anything of her, simply being there in the way of a man who was prepared to wait. She had thought about what she wanted him to be in her life, a friend, someone she admired, and was glad to know, someone who made rooms brighter by being in them. She wanted all of these things from him. She wanted to keep all of these things. And then she had thought about Callum. Thinking about Callum was harder, because Callum gave you less to work with. He was not, like Ethan, a collection of vivid moments that you could line up and examine. He was more like the quality of a room, the light, the temperature, the way it felt to breathe in it. The library at 9 in the morning, the specific silence between them that was not awkward but was not nothing. The first evening, him saying, "It is simply what is right." The night at Whitmore House, standing beside her at the window, not filling the silence. "Good night, Marin." The offer of formal resources, given without condition, at cost to himself. She had thought about what she would have done differently in these past weeks, if she had not been managing her own feelings with such careful, exhausting precision. She would have spent more time in the library. Not because Callum was there, or not only, but because she liked being in the same room with him, the way you like being in a room with good light. His company did not require anything of her. It allowed everything. She would have noticed sooner. She had been working hard not to notice, which is a form of noticing, the particular quality of his attention to her. The way he listened, the way he spoke to her about things he cared about, which was rare, and which she had registered each time as a small gift, and which she now understood for what it was. By the 4th day she had arrived somewhere she could see clearly. Ethan she loved. She was using the word love deliberately, having examined it carefully from every angle, and decided it was accurate. Ethan she loved, in the way that some people become essential to your happiness, important and bright, people you would choose for a friend forever. What she felt for him was real. It was not small. It was also not the same as what she felt when she thought about Callum, which was something different, and deeper, and harder to name. The kind of feeling that doesn't arrive with drama, but builds in the way that things build when you are not watching them, until one day you turn around and it is simply there, very large, and you understand that it has been there for some time. She went to find Callum. He was in the library. Of course he was. It was 10 in the morning, and the light was coming through the window at its new angle, and his chair was turned toward it, as always, and he was reading something, and he looked up when she came in, and waited. She sat in her armchair. She looked at him. "I have thought about it," she said. "The time you offered me, I have used it, and I know what I want to say, and I am going to say it, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." He set down his book. He gave her his full attention, which with Callum meant everything stopped. "When I arrived here," she said, "I came with a plan. The plan was to be manageable and grateful, and to find a way out as quickly as possible, because I was not going to be anyone's obligation, and I was not going to let this situation become anything other than what it appeared to be on paper, which was a temporary arrangement." She paused. "That plan lasted approximately 2 weeks, and then it started to fail, and I have spent the past month pretending it was still intact." He said nothing. He was very still. "I care for your brother," she said. "I want to say that plainly. He is one of the most genuinely good people I have ever known, and I have been glad, every day, that he is in this house, and what I feel for him is real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She watched something move across Callum's face, not flinching, something more controlled than that. "Reception. And," she said, "I have found that what I feel for you is different, and larger, and has been growing in a way I have not been entirely ready to look at directly until now." She looked at the window. "You are the kind of person whose absence I would notice before I could name it. You are the kind of presence that has become something I can't imagine the room without." She looked back at him. "I am in love with you. I did not choose to be. I chose not to be, for quite a long time, and it didn't work." Silence. A very long, very full silence. He looked at her. His expression was the one she had been learning for 40 days. Layered, quiet, real. She could see all the way down through it now, or nearly. He said, "I have been trying not to say anything for several weeks." I know, she said. Because you were in a position where... I know, she said. I know why you were careful. And I want you to know that the carefulness, the fact that you were careful about that, is part of it. Part of why I am here saying this. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood. He came to her. Not rushing, not all at once, but deliberately, the way Callum did everything. And crouched in front of her chair so they were eye to eye. And he looked at her, and she looked at him. He said, "Are you certain?" "I am," she said. He took her hand, just her hand, with both of his, and held it. Nothing more than that. A simple, careful thing. Full to the edges, with everything that had been waiting in both of them for the past 6 weeks. She breathed. She thought, this is what it feels like when something stops being a question. After a while he said, "Ethan." "I know," she said. "I need to speak with him." "I will speak with him first," Callum said. "No," she said. "I need to do it." He looked at her. He understood. He released her hand and stood, and she stood, and they were in the library in the morning light, and everything had changed in the space of 10 minutes, and the room was the same room it had always been, with the books and the 2 chairs and the sun across the floor. She was going to cry if she stayed in this room. She was not going to cry in this room. She said, "I'll find Ethan." He nodded. She went to find Ethan. He was in the orchard. She could see him from the garden path, moving between the trees, with a tool she could not name, attending to the bark of one of the old apple trees, with the focused attention he gave to all living things. He heard her on the gravel, and turned, and the look on his face when he saw her, told her, very clearly, that he already knew. Not specifically, but he knew something had shifted, because he always knew, and because Callum was not with her, and because she was walking toward him with a purpose he could read. She stopped a few feet from him. He said, "Tell me straight." "You know what I am going to say," she said. "Tell me anyway." She told him, plainly, with every courtesy she could give it, and with the truth of how much she valued him, and with nothing left out that should be in, and nothing added that was only for comfort. She told him that Callum was where she had arrived, and that she had arrived there honestly, and that what she felt for Ethan was real and would not change, and that she was sorry. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. He stood very still in the orchard with his tool in his hand and the old apple trees all around him, and he listened to every word, and when she finished there was a silence that was different from any silence she had experienced in his company before, heavier, true. Then he said, "All right." She said, "Ethan." "No, I mean it," he said. "All right." He looked at the tree he had been tending. He ran his thumb along the bark. "I knew," he said. "Somewhere I knew. I have been watching the 2 of you in the library for 3 weeks." "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry for that," he said. "Don't be sorry for what's true." He looked at her then, and his eyes were clear, and his face was the real one, the one underneath all the brightness. "Are you happy?" She thought about the library, Callum's hand holding hers. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. He went back to the tree. She stood there for a moment, watching him. She thought, I am going to grieve this too. Not what I have decided, but what it means for Ethan. And I am going to hold this carefully, because he deserves to have it held carefully. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "The climbing rose," she said. "The one with opinions. When it flowers, will you show me?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not grief exactly, but something that was acknowledging the weight of the moment without performing it. "Yes," he said. She went back to the house. Callum was in the hall. He had not gone back to the library. He was simply there, as if he had known she would come back through the front door, and he looked at her and saw what she was carrying, and he did not ask questions. He simply put his arm around her, for the first time. And this was the first time he had touched her in anything other than a formal way, and it was whole and steady and warm, and she leaned into it for a moment. Then she stood back. "He is all right," she said. "He will be all right." "He will," Callum agreed. "He is stronger than he seems, and he seems quite strong." She looked at the hall. The dark wood, the paintings, the fire that was always going. "I think," she said, "I would like to stay." He looked at her. "I was hoping," he said, "you would say that." She wrote to Harriet that afternoon. The letter was not long. It said that she was grateful for the invitation, that Harriet was very kind, and that she had decided to remain at Caldwell Manor. She said she hoped very much to see Harriet in the summer, if Harriet was inclined to visit the north, and that she looked forward to knowing her better. She sealed it, and gave it to the footman. Then she sat at the writing desk in her room, and looked at the window and thought, "I have just made the largest decision of my life, at a small desk in someone else's house. Not someone else's. Not anymore. Or becoming not. Or heading, slowly, in that direction." She had a great deal to think about still. There were practical matters. The settlement Callum had offered, which would need to be handled properly. The question of what her position here was, and what it was going to become. The fact that she had arrived as a ward, and was leaving that classification behind, and entering something with no clear name yet, which required naming. These were things that required conversations, careful ones, which she was going to have, in time. But the afternoon was good. The light was the new light, the one that had been arriving more strongly each week, and the garden was beginning to stir. She could see it from the window, the faint green beginning of things along the borders. The rose with opinions was going to put out its first growth very soon. She thought about Ethan in the orchard. She thought about what he had looked like tending the apple tree. Steady, absorbed, completely himself. He was going to be all right. She was sure of this, in the way that you are sure of some things, not because you have evidence, but because you know the person. He was too much himself to be broken by a thing he had chosen to enter with his eyes open. She thought about Callum in the hall. The specific weight and warmth of that arm around her, the first time, and the particular feeling of being steadied by someone who had been studying the terrain long enough to know exactly how. She thought about the conversation she had had with him, half an hour before, after she had come in from the orchard. She had told him what Ethan had said, that he had known, that he had been watching them in the library. Callum had been quiet for a moment, and then had said, "My brother is one of the most perceptive people I know. He sees things before they are there." "Do you?" she had asked. "Not always," he had said. "I saw this. I did not know what to do about it." "Neither did I," she had said. "You handled it better than I did," he said. "You were honest about it sooner." "I was not honest about it for weeks," she said. "I was very carefully not honest." "You got there," he said. "That is what counts." She looked at the window. She had arrived here 6 weeks ago, with 2 trunks and no plan worth keeping. And she had lost the plan immediately, and spent 6 weeks building something else instead, without knowing that was what she was doing. And now the building had a shape, and she could see it, and it was, she looked at it honestly, it was good. She did not know how long the road was still. She was realistic enough to know that deciding you love someone is the beginning of a thing, not the end of it, and that beginnings are hopeful, but also long, and not without their difficulties. She was not a naive person. She had seen enough of life in the past year to know that even good things required work. But she was here, and the garden was coming back. And the chimney was singing in the wind again, that low, almost musical sound, and the house was settled around her with its thick walls and its old certainty, and Clara was in the dressing room quietly doing something useful, and somewhere below her, Callum was in the library, and Ethan was in the orchard, and this was the house. She was in it. She got up from the desk. She went to the window. She put her hand on the glass, which was cold on the outside and warm on the inside, the way glass is when a room is properly heated against the world. She looked out at the garden for a long time. Then she went downstairs to see about dinner. The first dinner after was not comfortable. She had expected it to be difficult, and she had steeled herself, and it was still harder than she had prepared for. Not because anything wrong was said or done, because Ethan sat in his chair and ate his food and said things, ordinary things, the kind of things he always said, and he was Ethan, recognizably and completely Ethan, and he was also clearly carrying something tonight that he was not going to put down just to make the meal easier. He was graceful about it. She would remember this always, that he was graceful. He asked about the estate. He asked Marin about the letter she had written to Harriet, with the same interested attention he had always given to her correspondence, which meant he had remembered she was writing it, and had thought to ask, which was Ethan all the way through. He made one observation about the weather turning that made Callum almost smile, because it was perfectly timed and Ethan knew it. He did not address what had happened. She was glad and sorry in equal measure. Glad, because addressing it at the dinner table would have required a kind of performance from all three of them that none of them had. Sorry, because not addressing it meant carrying it through the meal like a piece of furniture that was inconveniently placed, but that no one was suggesting moving. After dinner, when Callum had stepped out for a moment to speak with the estate manager who had arrived unexpectedly, she found herself alone with Ethan in the sitting room for the first time since she had spoken to him in the orchard. He was at the window. She was near the door. She said, "Ethan." He turned. His face was the real one, as it had been in the orchard, not closed, not performing, just present. She crossed the room and sat, and gestured to the chair across from her, and after a moment he sat. She said, "How are you?" He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Honestly, I have been better." "I know," she said. "I also," he said, "have been worse. I want you to know that I am not devastated by this. I am disappointed and I am sad, and I will probably be both of those things for a while, and I think it would be more honest to say so than to pretend I'm entirely fine." "Yes," she said. "Please be honest. Don't perform fine for me." He nodded. "The same courtesy in return, please," he said. "Don't be so careful with me that you stop being yourself." She looked at him. "That is a very kind thing to ask for." "It is a selfish thing to ask for," he said. "I would rather you be yourself in this room and let me be myself than have both of us pretending around each other." She thought about this. She thought about how much easier it would have been, and how much worse, to have him retreat into good manners and distance. She thought about the particular courage of someone who prefers honesty to comfort, even when they are the one who has been hurt. "All right," she said. "Honestly then, I am sad too. Not about my decision. I am certain of my decision. But I am sad that it has cost you something, because I don't want you to be sad, and I can't do anything about it." He looked at the fire. "You couldn't have decided differently just to spare me, and we both know that." "No," she said. "I couldn't." "So," he said. He spread his hands. "So." The fire moved between them. The clock on the mantel measured the silence. He said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Was it the library?" he asked. "Was it the mornings in the library?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "because it was true, and because he deserved the truth." "Partly." He nodded slowly. "I thought so. I sat in the wrong chair." He said this with enough of his usual quality that she almost laughed, and she did not laugh, but the almost was something and he saw it, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I sat in my own chair," he corrected, "but the wrong chair was always going to be across from his, and I was always going to be too far away." She didn't know what to say to this. It was too accurate. "You'll find the right chair," she said, "in someone else's library." He looked at her. "That is," he said, "the most Marin thing you have ever said." She raised her eyebrows. "You managed to be comforting and completely practical in the same sentence," he said. "It is one of the things about you." "One of the things." "There's a list," he said. "It's quite long." She was going to cry. She was not going to cry. She was not going to cry in this sitting room while Ethan Caldwell made her laugh and ache at the same time, because both of those things were happening, and she could not afford both of them at once. She breathed. She steadied. "You will always be important to me," she said. "I want you to know that plainly. Whatever happens in this house, whatever changes, that does not." He looked at her. Something settled in his expression. Not resolved, not at peace with everything, but received. He had received it. "I know," he said. Callum came back into the room. He stopped when he saw them, and she watched him assess the room in the quiet, thorough way he assessed things, and then he moved to his usual chair and sat. "Mr. Bowen," he said, by way of explanation. "Crisis?" Ethan said. "Small one," Callum said. "The fence along the northern boundary again." "I'll look at it tomorrow," Ethan said. "I know which post it is." "I know you do," Callum said. She sat between them, and the fire burned, and the clock measured the evening, and it was not comfortable, exactly, but it was real. And real, she had learned in the past 7 weeks, was worth considerably more than comfortable. They said goodnight at the usual hour. Ethan's was the same as it always was. Easy, warm, directed at both of them without distinction. She watched him leave the room and thought, he is going to be all right. And she meant it. He was too grounded in himself to be permanently unmoored by grief, and she had seen, in the past weeks, what he was like with difficult things. He met them head on, without drama, with the same steady attention he gave the garden. He was going to be all right. She went to bed. Callum walked with her as far as the bottom of the stairs, which he had not done before, and they stood there for a moment in the hall, with its paintings, and its fire, and its particular quality of old settled permanence. He said, "Thank you for speaking with him." "I needed to," she said. "I know, but still." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I am." He nodded. She went up. The following days were a kind of calibration. All three of them were, in their different ways, adjusting to the new positions of things, finding the new distances, learning what was appropriate and what was not, what required navigation, and what had simply sorted itself into its correct place. Ethan did not become distant. She had been afraid of this. The polite retreat, the warmth replaced with careful courtesy. It didn't happen. He was Ethan. He was there in the mornings, and there at dinner, and there in the garden when she walked. And he talked about the things he always talked about. And he asked her questions about books, and about the weather, and about what she thought of the new boots he was considering buying from the cobbler in the village. And she answered. And it was not the same as before, and it was not wrong. It was different. It was a shape that was still forming, a shape that required both of them to keep choosing it instead of the easier alternatives. And they were both choosing it, and that was, she thought, its own kind of thing. She watched Callum watching this adjustment with the particular quality of a man who had a great deal of feeling and a limited number of ways to show it. He was careful with both of them. He was careful with Ethan in the way of an older brother who understands that what Ethan needs right now is not to be handled. He was careful with Maren in a different way, the way of a man who has waited for something for a long time and is now holding it, with the slight disbelief of someone who has it and is still checking that it is real. He checked by being attentive, by being present in ways he had not been before, or that he had been, but had not shown. The library in the mornings became something new, because now when she looked up from her book and found him at his desk, he sometimes looked up too, and what passed between them in those moments was not much in terms of words but was, she thought, very full in terms of everything else. One morning, perhaps 10 days after the conversation in the sitting room, she was reading, and she said something. A sentence from her book that she could not quite parse, something in the translation that seemed wrong, and she read it aloud to him without thinking about it, the way you read things aloud when you are trying to hear whether they are right. He put down his pen. He considered it. He said, "The second clause is wrong. It should be conditional, not declarative. The original is doing something the translation has missed." She looked at him. "How do you know the original?" "I read it in university," he said. "I was very earnest about it." "Did the earnestness help?" "It helped enough," he said. She smiled. He saw it, and something changed in his face, the way it changed when she was honest in front of him, the way it always changed when something between them was real. "Come here," he said. Not a request, not quite. Something else. She went to the desk. He showed her the passage in the original, which he found without looking. He knew these shelves. And he laid it open beside her book and showed her the difference, the specific thing the translator had missed. She leaned over the desk to look at it, and he was beside her, and the morning light was coming in at its new angle, and the fire was warm, and she thought, this is what I came here not knowing I was looking for. She thought about the fountain at the front of the house, which still did not run. She had asked Mrs. Elton about it once, early on, and Mrs. Elton had said it had not run since the old Duke died, that he had stopped it, and no one had started it again. She thought, someone should start it again. She thought, maybe in the spring. She stood in the library with the morning light across the books, and a man beside her who had been careful with her from the beginning, and she thought about all the things that had been stopped, and were about to run again. The week that followed had a different quality from all the weeks before it. Not dramatically different. The house was the same house. The rhythms were the same rhythms. Breakfast at 8, the library, the garden, dinner at 7. These were the constants. But within the constants, things had rearranged themselves, and the rearrangement was visible if you were looking, and she was always looking. Callum came to find her, on the third day, in the morning room. She was writing a letter, not to Harriet, but to a friend from before, a woman named Grace, who had moved to Edinburgh with her husband, and with whom Maren had corresponded infrequently in the past year, but who she missed, now that she had space to miss things. She looked up when he came in. He said, "I spoke with the solicitors this morning." She put down her pen. "About the settlement." "Yes." He sat in the chair across from her. "It is straightforward. It will not take long to arrange. You will have resources that are entirely your own, held separately, unconnected to this household." He paused. "I want to be clear that this is yours, regardless of anything, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen between us." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That is why I was able to accept it." He nodded. She said, "Callum." He looked at her. "What do you want?" she asked. "You have been very good at telling me what I need. What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited, because she had learned his silences. "I want," he said, slowly, "to know you for a long time. I want to be the person you read aloud to in the library." A pause. "I want to be the one in the library." She felt this settle somewhere in her. "The one in the library," she said. "The one who stays," he said. She looked at him, and thought about all the ways you could say a thing, and all the ways you could leave a thing unsaid, and the specific bravery of a man who had been careful for months, and was now, in a small morning room, saying something very plain. "Yes," she said. That was enough, for now. Both of them knew it was enough, and both of them let it sit in the room like something solid and good. She picked up her pen. He sat with her for a while. Not reading, not working, simply there. After perhaps 20 minutes he stood and said he had to see about the estate, and he left, and she finished her letter to Grace, and sealed it, and gave it to the footman, and she went back to her room, and stood at the window for a while. The garden was greening. She could see it clearly now, a definite, visible green, small and determined, along the borders. The rose bush at the south wall had put out a few red canes, thin and new, reaching in at least 2 directions with the same confident indifference to instruction as always. She had been here for 52 days. She thought about who she had been when she arrived, the woman on the gravel drive who had refused to be helped out of the carriage, who had looked at the house with the careful eyes of someone who expected nothing, and intended to need nothing, and was going to be perfectly fine about all of it. She thought about that woman, and felt a complicated tenderness toward her, the kind you feel for your past self when you can see clearly what the past self could not see, that the very determination she had arrived with was the thing that had made her worthy of what she had found. She had not been manageable. She had not been grateful in the diminished way. She had been herself, carefully and sometimes imperfectly, and she had been seen doing it, and that was, she now understood, how it worked. Ethan knocked on her door that evening, for the first time since the orchard conversation. She said come in, and he did, and he was carrying a small pot with something growing in it, a seedling of something she could not identify, green and upright and new. "For the windowsill," he said, "when the rosemary gave out." She looked at the seedling, then at him. "What is it?" she asked. "A lavender," he said. "It'll take a season to establish, but after that, it'll come back every year without much help." She took the pot. She turned it in her hands. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the real face, open, clear, a little sad and not hiding it. "You're welcome," he said. He left. She put the lavender on the windowsill where the rosemary had been. She stood looking at it for a long time, this small, new, patient thing that was going to take a season to establish, but would come back every year after that. She thought about what it meant that Ethan had given it to her, and she thought it meant many things at once, which was very Ethan, and she was going to hold it exactly as such. She thought about seasons, how long they are, how much happens in them. She had arrived in the deep of winter with nothing, and she was standing in a room that was hers, in a house that was becoming hers, with a lavender on her windowsill, and a man in the library who wanted to stay, and another man in the garden who was going to show her the rose when it bloomed. And spring was coming, actually and truly coming, and the green was already in the garden proving it. She set the lavender in the light. She went to dinner, too. Spring arrived, the way it always arrives in the north. Not all at once, but in increments, each one almost unnoticeable, until you looked back at where you had started, and understood how far you had come. The rose with opinions bloomed in late April. Maren was in the garden when it happened, not watching for it, not waiting, but simply there when she saw it. One small, extraordinarily red bloom among the new canes on the south wall, exactly where the rose had chosen to put it, rather than where Ethan had guided it. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Ethan found her there 20 minutes later. He came around the corner from the kitchen garden with his usual ease and his usual unhurried attention, and he stopped when he saw what she was looking at, and he stood beside her. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. It was the right size for what it was, small but perfect, the kind of red that doesn't apologize for itself. A single bloom on a wall in late April, on a rose that had been making its own decisions for 3 years, and had finally, in its own time, produced exactly what it was going to produce. Ethan said, "I told you it owed me." "It produced exactly one flower on the wrong wall," she said. "It's the right wall," he said. "It just isn't the wall I asked for." She looked at it. "I think it's better here," she said. He considered this. "Yes," he said, "I think it probably is." They stood there together for a while. The morning was bright, a real spring morning, the kind that makes you forget the winter completely, even though you know, rationally, that you spent it here, in this garden, in the cold. The light was clean and warm, and the garden was green in the serious, committed way of spring, not the tentative way of the first few weeks. She thought about the day she had arrived, the gravel drive, the fountain that wasn't running, the house looking at her with its pale stone and its unlit windows. She thought about the first dinner, and Ethan's trowel on the table, and Callum's voice saying, "It is simply what is right." She thought about the rain, and the wrong door, and the rosemary in the passage. She thought about how long 7 months is, and how short it is. "Ethan," she said. "Yes. Thank you," she said. "For the lavender." "It's doing well," he said. "It is. It's very happy on the windowsill." He smiled. Lavender likes south-facing windows. Good choice of room. She had not chosen the room. It had been chosen for her. But it was a south-facing window, and the lavender was happy, and some things work out because of luck, and some because of design, and the best ones because of both. "There is something I want to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "Callum and I have spoken with the solicitors," she said, "about a formal arrangement." He was quiet. "He asked me," she said, "last week, in the library." She paused. "He did it in the library, because that is where things happen for us, apparently. Which I suspect you knew." Ethan looked at the rose. "I suspected," he said. "I was still waiting to be certain." "You can be certain now," she said. He took a breath, let it out, looked at the garden, the full, bright, determined April garden. "I am glad," he said, and she believed him, not because it cost him nothing, but because she understood that he was large enough to hold both his own feeling and her happiness in the same moment, which was the kind of person he was, and had always been. "Are you really?" she asked, because she needed to know the truth of it. He looked at her. "I am really," he said, not without difficulty, but really. She nodded. He said, Is he happy?" She thought about Callum in the library, the day after he had asked her. She had come downstairs and he had been at his desk, but his chair was turned toward the window, and when she had come in he had turned to look at her, and the expression on his face, the expression that was hard to read until you knew it, and once you knew it was entirely legible, had been happy. Simply, plainly, quietly happy, in the way of a man who has not expected to be happy for a long time and is slightly startled to find himself there. "Yes," she said. Ethan smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine, and it reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "He has not been happy enough." He looked at the rose again. "He gets the whole house warm in winter, you know. He checks the fires himself, every room, before he goes to bed. He has done it his whole life. It never occurs to him that anyone notices." She had not known this. She was going to think about this for a long time. "He notices everything," she said. "He does," Ethan agreed. "He has just never been sure anyone noticed him back." She looked at the rose, small, red, certain. "I notice him," she said. They stood in the garden until the morning was properly established, and the light was full and warm, and the birds were loud in the orchard. And then Ethan said he had work to do, and went back to the kitchen garden, and she stayed at the south wall a little longer. She was going to remember this morning. She knew she was going to remember it the way you know certain things in the moment they are happening, not with nostalgia, which is a backward feeling, but with a kind of present-tense attention that stores things carefully. The rose, the light, the garden, Ethan walking away through the green. She went inside. She found Callum in the library. He was at the desk. He looked up when she came in, and she smiled, and it was the one Ethan had described, the one that happened before she decided about it. She went to the armchair. She sat. She opened her book. After a moment he said, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. "The rose has bloomed," she said. He looked up. "Has it?" "On the south wall. One flower, exactly where it chose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ethan will be pleased." "He is," she said. He went back to his work. She went back to her book, and the bar of spring sunlight crossed the floor between them, wider than it had ever been in the winter, reaching almost to her chair. She read. She was not pretending to read. She was actually reading, and it was a good book, and she was going to finish it, and after she finished it she was going to put it back on the shelf and take down the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that, because there were books in this room she had not read yet, and she had, it appeared, all the time she needed. Harriet wrote back in May. She said she was so glad Marin had found her feet, and that she had always thought the Caldwell name was a fine one, and that she looked forward very much to visiting in the summer, and that Bath was lovely, but terribly warm. Mrs. Elton brought the letter up. She set it on the desk and said, "Mr. Ethan has found a young woman in the village who shares his interest in growing things, miss. He has been showing her the kitchen garden." Marin looked at her. Mrs. Elton said nothing else. But she allowed herself one small expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not, and then she took herself back to the door. "Mrs. Elton," Marin said. "Yes, miss." "The fountain at the front of the house," she said. "Do you know what it would take to start it running again?" Mrs. Elton paused. She turned back. She considered the question with the air of someone who has been waiting for it and has an answer ready. "Mr. Perkins could look at it," she said. "It is a simple mechanism. It was always simple. It was only ever a decision." Marin said, "Then let's make the decision." Mrs. Elton said, "Yes, miss." The fountain ran for the first time in 3 years, on a Tuesday in May, and Marin was at the upstairs window when it started. She heard it before she saw it, a sound she had not known the house made. Water on stone, moving and clean and continuous. She went to the window and there it was, running in the morning light, the water catching the sun and making small quick movements at the surface, the way water does when it is moving again, after a long time of being still. She stood at the window and watched it. She heard the library door open below, and then footsteps in the entrance hall, and then the front door, and she looked down, and Callum was standing on the steps below the window, looking at the fountain. Just standing, looking at it. After a moment he looked up. He saw her at the window. She raised one hand. He raised his. They looked at each other for a moment, the woman at the upstairs window, and the man on the steps below, with the fountain running between them and the spring light across the whole thing. She thought about the first day she had stood at a window in this house and seen a man in the garden who had looked up and waved. She had not waved back. She was waving now. He smiled. She saw it from the upstairs window, which meant it was not a small smile. It was the real one, the one she had been earning for 7 months, and it was worth every single careful day. She was still at the window when Ethan appeared from the side of the house. She had not known he was nearby. and stopped when he saw the fountain running. He stood with his arms at his sides for a moment, looking at it. Then he looked at his brother. Then he looked up at her. He grinned. Wide, genuine, entirely himself. She laughed. She was still laughing when she stepped back from the window and went to the door and down the stairs and through the hall and out the front door into the spring morning. The fountain was loud when you were near it, not too loud, but present, substantial, the sound of something doing what it was made to do. All three of them stood at the bottom of the steps. The water ran over the lip of the basin in a thin, clear sheet, and gathered and moved, and was altogether entirely alive, and the morning was bright, and the garden was green, and the house stood behind them, with its old pale stone, and its unshuttered windows. And somewhere in the kitchen garden, a bird was making a territorial claim to a piece of territory it had already clearly won. She was going to write to Grace again today. She was going to tell her about the fountain, because Grace would understand about fountains, and about things that had been stopped and had started again, and about spring. She was going to sit in the library tomorrow morning, and read the next book on the shelf, and hear Callum's pen on paper, and watch the bar of sunlight cross the floor. She was going to find the right moment to meet the woman from the village who grew things, and to see whether she was the right shape for Ethan's life, and she suspected she was, because growing things and growing people are not so different, and Ethan had always known what needed tending. She was home, not because she had been told she was, not because the paperwork said so, not because she had nowhere else to go. She was home because she had arrived at a place and found it good and chosen it anyway, and choice was what made any place real. The fountain ran. The spring light lay across everything. Marin Ashford, Marin Caldwell, soon, in the language the world would use, though she had already been using it quietly in her own mind for some time, stood between two brothers on the steps of a good house on a good morning, and felt, completely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The fountain ran on. Clara, who had been watching everything from the hall window, allowed herself the first unguarded expression she had permitted in 7 months. She turned back to the room she was tidying and resumed work, but she was smiling, the small and private smile of a woman who had served this particular family for 50 years, and who had known, from the first morning when Miss Ashford had come downstairs at 7 o'clock and sat in the kitchen with her tea, that this was going to be all right. She had not said this to anyone. Clara did not say things to anyone. She observed, and she maintained, and she kept her own counsel, and she let people arrive at their own conclusions, because that was the only way that conclusions held. But she had known. The letter from Harriet arrived the following week with confirmation of a summer visit, and Marin wrote back to tell her to come in July, and to warn her that the morning room had no sun, which Harriet would need to know in order to bring her work to the right window. She sealed the letter and thought, briefly, about Harriet's offer of the serviceable room and bath, and about how the word serviceable had sat in her when she read it, and how different it was from this. This was not serviceable. This was real, and well-made, and deeply particular, and hers. She was not a woman who spent time being grateful at the expense of being present. Gratitude was a feeling she trusted in small, honest doses, not the performed kind, not the overwhelming kind that paralyzed you, but the ordinary, daily kind that arrived when you were paying attention, when the tea was good, when the morning light came in at the right angle, when a man looked up from his work and caught your eye, and there was nothing to say, and nothing needed to be said. She was grateful in that way, steadily, without drama. The solicitors finished their work in the 3rd week of May. The settlement was in place. She had resources of her own, held separately, clean, and unconditional. She looked at the papers and signed them and handed them back to the solicitor, who was a small, efficient man who clearly did not know the full shape of the story behind the paperwork and was content not to know, which was a professional virtue she respected. Callum asked her, the evening after the papers were signed, whether it felt different. She thought about this. Yes, she said. It feels like I was always standing on solid ground, but I wasn't certain it was solid. Now I'm certain. He nodded. Good, he said. That is what it should feel like. Did you feel that way? She asked. When you inherited the estate? He considered. The estate was different, he said. I had grown up knowing it would come to me. There was no moment of uncertainty, just the moment of responsibility. Is that better or worse? Neither, he said. It is simply a different shape of the same thing. She thought about this. What was the hardest part? He was quiet for a moment. The library, he said. My father used the library every morning. I did not use it for 6 months after he died, because it took time. She looked at him. She thought about the chair turned toward the window. She thought about the morning she had come downstairs before 6 and found the coffee cup already there. You went back, she said. Yes, he said. And now I'm there, she said. Now you're there, he agreed, and looked at her with the expression that she had learned completely, every layer of it, from the surface down to the thing at the bottom that was simply, plainly, Callum, and she held his gaze and thought, this is what I was not looking for, and found anyway, and it is better than anything I would have looked for. That was the shape of it. There were, in the months that followed, things she could not have predicted. Ethan's young woman from the village, whose name was Frances, and who had a way of disagreeing with Ethan that suggested she was going to be very good for him. The letter from her father's old colleague that arrived in autumn and required a small legal response that Callum managed before she even knew about it, which she found out afterward, and which produced a conversation about things he should not manage on her behalf without her knowledge, which was a good conversation, and one they needed to have. The evening in late September, when she was reading in the library, and Callum set down his pen and said something she had known was coming for months, and she said yes, without hesitation. Yes, without hesitation. She had hesitated over so many things in her life. She had measured and calculated, and been careful. She was still careful. She was always going to be careful, because careful was not timidity, it was paying attention, and paying attention was what you did when things mattered. She said yes, without hesitation, because she had already been saying it, quietly and incrementally, for 7 months. The word at the solicitor's office had simply been the formal version. Callum looked at her when she said it, and she watched the stillness of him become a different kind of stillness. Not the held-back kind, but the full kind, the kind that has room for everything. They told Ethan at dinner. He was, by this time, spending a great deal of his time with Frances, and his evenings had a different quality. Lighter, if that were possible for Ethan, who had always been light, but with a lightness that was aimed somewhere new, and this was very good to see. He raised his wine glass. To the only woman, he said, who could make this house better than it already was. She looked at him. It was already very good, she said. It was, he agreed. And now it is more so. She looked at Callum, who was looking at his brother with the expression of a man who has known someone their whole life and is still occasionally surprised by them, in the best possible way. She raised her glass. They drank. The evening moved toward its end, with the ease of things that have found their rhythm. Mrs. Elton came to say good night. Clara appeared briefly at the door with something that needed Marin's attention and departed with it sorted. The fire burned. The clock measured the last part of the day. And when they said good night and went upstairs, the house was as it had always been. The thick walls, the deep quiet, the paintings in the hall, the fire carefully managed against the autumn cold, every room checked before bed by a man who did not know anyone noticed. The fountain ran in the dark outside. She noticed. She had always noticed. She was going to go on noticing, for a long time. All the ways this house and these people took care of things, without announcement or ceremony, simply because it was what you did when you cared about something, and she was going to do the same in return. And this was the life she had arrived at from a carriage on a winter morning, with 2 trunks, and a plan that had not survived its first contact with a family that turned out to be entirely unlike what she had prepared for. She had not planned for any of it. She was glad. She was so glad. She went to sleep in a house that was hers, beside a man who had been careful with her because he understood what it was to be worth caring for, and the fountain ran outside in the dark, and the roses would come back in spring, and the lavender on the windowsill was establishing itself exactly as promised, patient and green, and already certain that it was going to be here for a very long time.